God, how long have you been living here? Richard Whitmore stood beside the old Buick, one hand still raised near the driver's side window. His face was tight with anger. He glanced quickly around. "No house?" he said, his voice lowering, sounding more like he was talking to himself than to the young woman in front of him. "No apartment? Nowhere to go?" Annie rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand. Her voice was so small it nearly disappeared into the cold morning air. "I don't have a home anymore." Richard blinked at her. Those words should have softened him. Maybe on another morning, under different circumstances, they might have made him stop and think. But right now, he was standing on damp grass in expensive leather slippers, staring at deep tire marks carved into the lawn his landscaping crew had spent 3 weeks restoring after the last storm. "Your housing situation has nothing to do with me," he said, pointing down at the ground. "But this is private property, my property. Do you understand? You can't drive this piece of junk onto someone else's land and sleep here like it's some roadside motel." Tears spilled from Annie's eyes before she could stop them. She turned slightly, one hand resting on the steering wheel, as if she were touching the shoulder of someone she loved. "It's not a piece of junk," she whispered. "It was my mother's old car." Richard let out a short, dry breath, without the slightest trace of sympathy. "I don't care whether it's junk or your mother's car." He stepped back and kicked the front tire. The Buick gave a dull, tired thud. Annie flinched, as if his foot had struck something alive. "If it's sitting on my land," Richard said, "then it's costing me money. Do you see this lawn? This is not a park. This is not a public parking lot. This is irrigation, landscaping, maintenance, security cameras, insurance, and liability. If your car leaks oil, I have to pay to clean it up. If one of my employees slips because of this thing, I'm responsible. If the homeowners association gets a complaint about an abandoned vehicle parked near the main road, I'm the one who has to deal with it. If the gate cameras record an unfamiliar car on the property, my security team has to file a report. Every minute this car stays here, it becomes my problem." Annie lowered her head. A strand of hair slipped out from beneath her old scarf. She hurriedly wiped her face, but the tears kept falling. "I'm sorry," she said. "I got off work before sunrise. I was exhausted. I thought I had parked near the side road. I only meant to close my eyes for a little while." Richard folded his arms across his chest. His voice turned cold. "Then open your eyes and go somewhere else. I want you off this property before I call a tow truck." Annie froze for a second, then nodded quickly, as if obeying fast enough might keep things from getting worse. She reached for the key still hanging in the ignition. Her trembling fingers made the small metal ring clink against the steering column. "Yes, sir. I'll leave. I'm sorry. I'll leave right now." She turned the key. The Buick coughed once, then silence. A rough, hoarse sound came from beneath the hood, like an old machine trying to wake after a long illness. Annie pressed the gas pedal lightly, whispered something under her breath, and turned the key again. The engine gave 2 weak bursts, shuddered, then died completely. Richard stared at the hood. Annie closed her eyes for half a second. When she opened them, panic was plain in her face. "Come on," she whispered to the car. "Please." She tried again. The engine made only a choked clicking sound, then went silent. Richard stepped closer. "Are you kidding me?" "I'm sorry," Annie said quickly. "It does this sometimes when it's cold. Just give me 1 minute. Please. I can get it started. You can't even make this car run, and you thought you could park it on my property? I didn't mean to park here. I told you. I was exhausted." "Exhausted?" Richard frowned. "Then go home and sleep. Or did the whole city run out of places, so you chose my land because you thought a rich man would feel sorry for you?" Annie looked as if those words had hurt more than the kick he had given the tire. Her chin trembled, but her hand stayed wrapped around the key. "I wasn't trying to take anything from you," she said. "I swear. You already are. You're taking up space. You're creating a problem. You're making me stand out here dealing with this before breakfast." "I know. I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't repair damage." She looked up at him, confused and frightened. "Damage? The tire tracks. The grass. My time. The calls I'll have to make if this car leaks anything into the ground. The maintenance crew I'll have to send out here. Do you think a property like this keeps itself clean?" Annie swallowed hard. "I don't have any money." Richard's face hardened again. "Then why is that my problem?" Her tears came again. This time, she couldn't wipe them away fast enough. I don't have $1 left, she said, her voice breaking. I'm not saying that to sound pitiful. I really don't. I put gas in after my shift. I've only got about $3 left, and I need that for tomorrow. Richard looked at her as if he had been ready for a lie, but somehow the truth irritated him even more. So let me understand this, he said. You parked on private property, damaged my lawn, slept in your car, and now you can't even pay for what you've done? I didn't mean to damage anything. That's not an answer. I know. He exhaled sharply through his nose, impatient and annoyed. Start it again. Annie turned the key. The Buick clicked. Nothing happened. She tried one more time. The engine gave a weak cough, then died. I can do it, she said, tears breaking through although her voice stayed small. Please, just 2 minutes. I don't have a home, sir. I'm not saying that so you'll pity me. I'm only telling you the truth. Please give me 2 minutes to start it. Then I'll leave. You'll never have to see me again. Richard did not answer. His eyes moved past her and into the car. It wasn't as messy as he had expected. A blanket was folded neatly on the seat. A few books lay in order on the floor. A brown paper bag sat beside them. A notebook rested near the gearshift, its pages filled with small numbers and carefully written dates. Everything was arranged with care. Poor, yes. Temporary, yes, but not careless. Still, Richard quickly pushed the thought aside. 2 minutes, he said. That's all. Annie nodded. Thank you. Don't thank me. Start the car. She turned the key again, more gently this time, as if she were afraid of hurting the car. She waited a moment, wiped her face with her sleeve, then tried again. The engine choked, caught for one uneven second, then died. No, she whispered. No, no, no. Richard shook his head, tired and irritated that his morning had been dragged into something he never wanted to deal with. There it is again, he said. Is that your plan? You and this car just sit here until I feel guilty enough to let you stay? Annie looked at him quickly. No, that's not what I'm doing. Then what are you doing? I told you, I'm trying to leave. With a car that won't start? It's old, she said, wiping her face again. That's all. It does this sometimes. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't come here to trap you. Richard's voice rang out across the wet lawn. Then get this piece of junk off my property right now. Annie flinched, but this time, something inside her changed. Her fingers brushed against the faded red ribbon tied around the steering wheel. This is not junk, she said, her voice softer than before, but clearer. This is the only thing my mother left me. Richard opened his mouth to answer. Then he stopped. Richard's eyes stayed on the steering wheel longer than Annie expected. The ribbon tied around it had faded. What had once been red was now pale, its edges thin and frayed, as if too many fingers had touched the same place over too many years. Just beneath it was a small photograph, held in place by a strip of tape that had yellowed at the corners. In the picture was a black woman wearing the city's orange sanitation jacket. She stood near the curb, one hand holding a long broom, the other holding a brown paper lunch bag. She was smiling, a tired smile, but a warm one. Beneath the photograph, written carefully in black marker, was the name, Margaret Carter. Richard said nothing. Annie looked at his face, and his silence frightened her more than his shouting had. That's my mother, she said, her voice trembling. Please don't damage it. I know it's old, but that's the only picture I have of my mother smiling like that. Richard turned to look at her. Your mother's name was Margaret Carter? Yes, sir. She worked for the city? Annie nodded, quickly wiping her tears with the sleeve of her work uniform. Street sanitation, mostly downtown. She wore that jacket every day, even when it was hot, even on days when her legs hurt so badly she could barely climb the stairs. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, as if he had been about to say something, and then swallowed it back. Annie misunderstood the look. She quickly reached for the key again, her voice growing more panicked. I can get it started, I promise. I just need a little more time. Sometimes it takes a few tries before the engine turns over. Please don't call anyone to tow it. I don't have the money to get it back. If they take it, I really won't have anywhere left to go. Richard still said nothing. I'm not lazy, she went on. I know people think that when they see me sleeping in here, but I'm not. I work the night shift at the market on Cascade Road. On weekends, if they call me, I clean tables and pick up extra work. I've been trying to save enough to rent a small room somewhere, But after my mother got sick, every dollar went to the hospital. Every envelope, every paycheck, every bit of change she hid in the kitchen drawer. We used it all, and it still wasn't enough. Richard's eyes moved from Annie to the dashboard. A folded paycheck lay beside a gas receipt and a cheap black ballpoint pen. Near the gearshift was a small notebook, open to a page filled with numbers written close together: gas, food, phone, medicine, laundry. At the bottom of one page, written smaller than the rest, was one line: save for deposit. Annie saw him looking at the notebook and pulled it closer, as if ashamed to have her life exposed in front of a stranger. "I'm trying," she said softly. "I really am." From the front steps of the house, Harold Benson walked over, his phone already in his hand. "Mr. Whitmore," Harold said, stopping a few steps away, "I can have a tow truck here in 15 minutes. Annie turned sharply toward him. Her face went pale. "No, please." Harold looked at her with a cold kind of politeness. "Miss, this is private property. I know, I'm sorry, I'm trying to leave." "In a car that won't start?" "It will. It's just—" She stopped, because even she could hear how weak her own voice sounded. "It's old, that's all." Harold turned to Richard. "Sir, we can't encourage this. Once people think your driveway can be used freely, they'll start talking. Then there will be more cars, more situations, more complaints. It will become a problem." He continued, his voice flat and procedural. "I understand this is unpleasant, but the best thing is to handle it firmly. We can photograph the tire tracks, document the damage, charge what needs to be charged, and move on." "Charge me?" Annie lifted her head, panic filling her eyes. "I already told him, I don't have any money." Harold pressed his lips together. "That does not erase your responsibility." Annie's hands began to shake again. "I'll fix the lawn. I don't know how, but I'll come back after work. I can pull weeds, wash cars, clean windows, anything. Just please don't take my car, please. It was my mother's car. She died in April. I haven't even—" Her voice broke before she could finish the sentence. She pressed her fist against her mouth and turned away. Richard looked back at the photograph. "Margaret Carter," he murmured. Annie sniffed and turned toward him. "Did you know my mother?" Richard did not answer right away. The question pulled him back into a memory from long ago. Downtown Atlanta, many years earlier. The noon heat rising from the concrete. A younger Richard sat near a bus stop with a nearly useless folder on his lap and not a dollar left in his pocket. He had come to the city looking for a job opportunity, but that opportunity had turned out to be a scam. The man who had promised him an interview had taken the last money Richard had under the name of a processing fee, then disappeared. At the time, a woman in an orange jacket had stopped sweeping nearby. She watched him for a moment, then walked over and sat down at the other end of the bench. She opened a brown paper bag, took out half a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and handed it to him. "Now listen," she said, her voice plain but kind. "Don't sit at a bus stop in the middle of the day looking like you just lost a fight with the whole city." Richard still remembered how ashamed he had felt when he took that half sandwich. He remembered how, afterward, she had pressed a few folded bills into his hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a bus ride and one more meal. He had told her that one day he would pay her back. Richard had thought about that woman often in the early years that followed. Then less and less, as his life became filled with money, schedules, meetings, and success. Her name faded first, then her face, but the feeling of that hunger, the kind that made him feel less than human, had never left him, and now her name was right in front of him, on the steering wheel of an old Buick. "Sir?" Annie called softly. Richard blinked, pulling himself back to the wet morning lawn. Harold looked impatient. "Mr. Whitmore, should I make the call?" "No." Harold stopped. "No, sir?" Richard turned to him. "Do not call the tow truck." Harold slowly lowered the phone. "Sir, honestly, I don't think that would be wise. I heard you the first time. But if we allow this—" "We are not allowing anything," Richard cut in. "We are dealing with a human being standing right in front of us." Annie stared at Richard, her eyes still wet and full of confusion. Richard stepped closer to the open window. This time, he moved more slowly, more carefully, as if he were afraid of frightening her further. "Annie." "Yes, sir. Your mother helped me once." Annie frowned. Confusion showed in her red, tear-filled eyes. "My mother?" Yes. She never told me about that. Maybe she didn't think it was worth mentioning. Annie let out a small sound, half laugh and half sob. That sounds like my mother. Richard looked back at the photograph. I was young then, broke enough to have nothing left in my pocket, but too proud to admit I was desperate. Someone had taken the last of my money. Your mother fed me. Then she gave me enough to get through that day. Annie's lower lip trembled. My mother was always like that, she said, even when we didn't have much. When I was little, I used to get mad at her for it. I would say, Mama, we need that too. And she would say, Baby, needing something doesn't mean you stop seeing other people's pain. If Margaret's words touched your heart, please give this video a like. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about kindness, justice, and the people who remind us what humanity truly means. Richard turned his face away for a moment. Harold took half a step back, looking uncomfortable now that the conversation had moved far beyond the procedures he knew how to handle. Annie wiped both cheeks with her sleeve. I'm sorry I parked here, she said. I really am. I didn't know whose house this was. I was so tired, and the road was quiet. And I just thought if I could sleep for 20 minutes, I'd have enough strength to work tonight. You're still planning to work tonight? Richard asked. She nodded. If they haven't replaced me already. I slept through a missed call from my manager. Richard looked at the car. And this is where you sleep? Annie hesitated. Shame showed clearly on her face. Most nights. Sometimes behind the laundromat. Sometimes near the church on Campbellton Road. I keep moving around so no one gets tired of seeing me. Those words cut into Richard more deeply than any accusation could have. He took a slow breath. Step out of the car. Fear immediately returned to Annie's eyes. Please don't make me leave it. I'm not taking your car. Then why? Richard looked straight at her. Because I owe you an apology, he said, and I want to say it while looking you in the eye. Annie did not step out right away. Her hand stayed on the steering wheel, fingers resting near the ribbon, and her eyes moved from Richard to Harold and then to the wide house behind them. The front door alone looked heavier than anything she owned. The windows were tall and clean. The stone steps had no cracks. Even the porch chairs looked like they had never sat in weather they did not choose. I can hear you from here, she said. Richard understood what she meant. She did not want to leave the driver's seat because the driver's seat was the closest thing she had to a locked door. All right, he said. Then stay there. Harold made a small sound under his breath. Richard turned his head just enough to stop it. Annie wiped her face again and tried to sit straighter. She looked ashamed of the tears, ashamed of the car, ashamed of being seen in the morning when she had meant to be invisible. That was the part Richard noticed now. She had not come looking for him. She had not walked up his steps. She had not rung the bell and asked for a meal. She had pulled off the road, shut her eyes, and tried to disappear for a few minutes. I shouldn't have yelled, Richard said. Annie looked at him carefully, as if apology was a language she had heard before but did not trust without translation. I shouldn't have kicked the car either, he added. Her hand tightened. It scared me. I know. No, you don't, she said, then seemed frightened by her own honesty. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Don't apologize for that. She lowered her eyes. People get mad when I talk back. Were you talking back? I don't know. I guess telling the truth sounds like that sometimes. Richard had no quick answer for that. He looked at the old Buick again. At the cracked light, the tape near the window, the dent above the wheel. A car like that in his driveway had looked like an insult 10 minutes ago. Now it looked like a witness. Harold shifted his weight. Mr. Whitmore, the 8:30 call. Move it. Harold blinked. The call? No, yourself. Go inside. Harold's lips pressed together. Of course. He gave Annie one last glance. The kind that pretended to be neutral and failed, then turned toward the house. Annie watched him leave. Only when the front door closed did her shoulders drop a little. He doesn't like me, she said. He doesn't know you. That doesn't stop people. Richard looked at her. It was not said with anger. That made it worse. She said it the way someone might say rain was coming. What happened to your apartment? He asked. Annie rubbed her thumb across the seam of the steering wheel. It was on the west side. 1 bedroom. Nothing fancy. The heater sounded like a truck when it kicked on, and the kitchen sink leaked if you turned it too far. But Mama loved it. She put curtains up the first day, even before we unpacked. Yellow ones from Goodwill. She said a room isn't yours until you hang something soft in the window. Richard listened. She got sick slow at first. Tired all the time. Swelling in her legs. Then she started missing work. Then the bills came. I thought bills came after people got better. Annie gave a small, broken laugh. That's stupid. I know. It isn't. They came while she was still in the hospital. Every week. Envelopes on the table. I'd stack them by the microwave and pretend that if they were neat, they weren't real. Richard could see the apartment as she spoke. Not because she described every corner, but because certain details carried the whole place. Yellow curtains. A leaking sink. Envelopes beside a microwave. A daughter trying to make terror look organized. Did anyone help you? He asked. People tried. She said it quickly, loyal even to help that had not been enough. Church ladies brought food. Mrs. Bell from downstairs drove me to the hospital twice. My manager let me switch shifts for a while. But sickness is expensive in a way kindness can't keep up with. Richard looked away. Annie continued because once the door opened, the story seemed to come through whether she wanted it or not. Mama told me not to sell the car. She said if things got bad, at least I'd have wheels. I got mad at her for saying that. I told her things weren't going to get that bad. She swallowed. Then they did. The quiet after that was not empty. It held the wet grass. The idling silence of a car that would not start. The distance between a mansion and a girl who had slept in the driver's seat. Richard said, "When did you leave the apartment?" "June." He looked at her. "You've been in the car since June?" "Not every night," she said, as if that made it better. "A few nights with a friend, but her lease said no long guests. 2 nights in a motel when I had extra tips. 1 night at the hospital chapel, mostly here and there." "And school?" Her face changed. "I was supposed to start community college in August." "Supposed to?" I deferred. That's the word they used. Deferred sounds better than couldn't pay. "What were you going to study?" She hesitated, embarrassed by the size of the answer. "Business. Maybe accounting." Mama said I was good with numbers because I could stretch $20 until it begged for mercy. Richard almost smiled, but did not. The line hurt too much. Annie looked down at the notebook. "I still write it all down. Gas, food, laundry, phone. If I don't write it, I spend scared. If I write it, at least I know what's killing me." He looked at her hands. Young hands, dry at the knuckles, nails cut short, a small bandage wrapped around one finger. "And your father?" Richard asked. Annie's face closed. "No, that was all she gave him." Richard accepted it. "All right." A bird called from the hedge. Somewhere beyond the gate, a delivery truck moved along the road and kept going. Annie heard it and glanced at the ignition again. "I really need to leave," she said. "I don't want him calling someone when you go inside." "He won't." "You sure?" Richard thought of Harold's face, the phone, the careful voice full of rules. "He works for me. That doesn't mean he listens when you're not looking." The sentence was too accurate for comfort. Richard reached into the pocket of his robe, then remembered he had come outside without his phone. The absurdity of that struck him. He owned companies in 4 states, could authorize 8-figure transfers before lunch, and at that moment he could not call a mechanic standing 10 feet from a broken car. "I'm going to have someone look at the engine," he said. Annie shook her head fast. "No, I can't pay for that. I didn't ask you to. I can't owe you." "You don't. That's what people say before they tell you what you owe." Richard studied her. "Who taught you to hear everything twice?" She looked at him, and for a second the answer was in her face. "Landlords. Hospitals. Managers. Notices on doors. Men with clipboards. People who smiled while explaining why nothing could be done. My mother," she said at last. "And life after her." Richard took that in. "Then hear this twice. I am not calling a tow truck. I am not taking the car. I am not asking you for money." Annie's eyes filled again, but this time she looked angry at herself for it. "Please don't be nice if you're going to change your mind." The words found him cleanly. He lowered his voice. "I knew your mother." She looked up. "Not well, not the way I should have, but I knew her for one afternoon, and I remember what she did for me." Annie stared at him. "What did she do?" Richard looked toward the gate, and the polished lines of his present seemed to loosen around him. "She fed me when I was hungry. Gave me bus fare when I had none. Talked to me like I was still a man when I didn't feel like one. Annie did not blink. Mama did that? Yes. She covered her mouth with one hand, not to hide tears this time, but to hold the memory of her mother in place. She used to come home with half her lunch still gone and say she wasn't hungry. I knew she was lying. I'd fuss at her. She'd tell me, Annie, if you count every kindness like a loss, you'll end up poor in places money can't fix. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. That was Margaret. There she was. Not in the photograph now, but in the sentence her daughter carried. When he opened his eyes, Annie was crying again, quietly, her shoulders shaking once, then stilling as she fought for control. I miss her, she said. I know that's not your problem. I know none of this is your problem. But I miss her so bad I keep sleeping in this car because sometimes, when it rains, it still smells like her hand lotion and old coffee. And if they tow it, I lose that too. Richard did not move. He had built his adult life on movement. Calls, deals, signatures, exits. For once, moving felt like the wrong thing. Annie, he said. She wiped her face and looked at him. Would you let me call a mechanic? She started to refuse. Not as charity, he said before she could speak. As a debt. I don't want your debt. It isn't yours. It's mine. She looked at the ribbon, then the photograph. My mama wouldn't want me taking advantage of anybody. No, Richard said. She wouldn't, but she also wouldn't leave someone sitting on a lawn with nowhere to go and call that principal. That reached her. He could see it. Annie breathed out slowly, broken and tired. Just the mechanic? Just the mechanic for now. And nobody touches the ribbon. Nobody touches the ribbon. And nobody throws anything away. Nothing gets thrown away. She nodded once, barely. Richard turned toward the house. Harold was standing behind the glass of the front door, pretending not to watch. Richard raised his voice just enough for it to carry. Harold, bring me my phone, and call Mr. Dawson from the garage. Harold opened the door. The restoration garage, sir? Richard looked back at the Buick, at Annie, at the photograph of Margaret Carter tied to the wheel. Yes, he said, the best one. Mr. Dawson arrived 26 minutes later in a white service truck with no decals on the side, the kind of plain vehicle rich people preferred when they wanted a problem handled without neighbors asking questions. He was in his 60s, broad through the shoulders, with gray hair under a Braves cap and hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime turning bolts. He parked near the gate instead of on the grass, walked up the drive carrying a black tool bag, and stopped when he saw the Buick. Well, he said, looking at Richard, you didn't call me out here for the Bentley. Richard did not smile. Can you look at it? Dawson glanced at Annie through the open window. Ma'am, is it all right if I pop the hood? Annie looked at Richard first, then back at the mechanic. The word ma'am seemed to unsettle her. People had called her girl, miss, sweetheart, honey when they wanted something, and ma'am when they wanted distance. But Dawson said it the way older men from small towns sometimes did, with no performance, only manners. Yes, sir, she said. The latch sticks. You have to pull it twice. Most old Buicks got one thing they make you ask nicely for. Dawson set his tool bag down and crouched near the grill. What year? 98, Annie said. You sure? She nodded. Mama used to say it was old enough to vote. Dawson gave a short laugh and pulled the hood release. It caught on the second try. The hood rose with a groan, and Annie flinched again. Not because it scared her this time, but because every sound from that car sounded like money she did not have. Richard noticed. You don't have to stand there waiting for bad news, he said. Annie looked at him. That's usually what news is. Dawson leaned over the engine. Battery's weak. Terminals are dirty. Belt's worn. Might have a fuel pump issue. Might not. Let me not insult the lady before I hear her talk. He turned to Annie. When did it start giving you trouble? A while ago. How long is a while? She hesitated. Maybe 2 months. Richard looked at her. She lowered her eyes. It still starts most days. Most days, Dawson repeated, not unkindly. And on the other days, I wait. Or I ask somebody for a jump if I'm near a store. Sometimes it works after I let it sit. Dawson nodded the way a doctor might nod at symptoms. He did not scold her. That alone seemed to make Annie's mouth tremble. I was going to fix it, she said quickly. I had money put aside, But then the apartment happened, and the funeral, and I had to choose. Nobody's accusing you, Dawson said. Harold stood near the steps with Richard's phone in his hand, still trying to look useful. Mr. Whitmore, if the vehicle requires more than a quick battery service, perhaps it would be better to remove it from the property and… Richard turned. Harold. Yes, sir? Stop talking about removing it. Harold's face tightened. Of course. Dawson looked between the men, decided the house had its own engine trouble, and returned to the Buick. He cleaned the terminals, tested the battery, checked the oil, tapped something near the intake, then asked Annie to turn the key. She did, and the engine coughed with more life than before, but still failed. Again, Dawson called. She tried again. The car caught for 3 seconds, rough and uneven. Then quit. Annie pressed both hands to the wheel. Please. That one word was not aimed at anyone standing there. It was aimed at the car, at the morning, at whatever small mercy might still be listening. Dawson straightened. She can be made to run, but not out here with me guessing. I need to get it to the shop. Annie's face went white. No. Dawson raised a hand. Not the junkyard. My shop. No, she said again, turning to Richard now. You said nobody would take it. I said nobody would tow it away from you. That sounds the same. It isn't. To you, maybe. Richard took that. She was right to be careful. He had lived long enough among contracts to know that people were often harmed in the space between similar words. Dawson wiped his hands on a rag. I can bring a flatbed and take it myself. She can ride along if she wants. Or follow with you. Nothing gets removed from the car unless she says so. Annie shook her head. I can't leave my things. We can lock the shop. I don't mean lock, her voice cracked. I mean I can't let people touch them. Richard looked inside the car again. He saw the folded blanket, the food bag, the books, the notebook, and the photograph beneath the ribbon. Not clutter. Evidence of a life reduced to what could fit between 2 doors. All right, he said. Then we empty it first. Annie looked startled. Into where? The house. No. Harold's eyes widened. Sir? Richard did not look at him. Into the guest room off the library. No one touches anything without her permission. Annie's hand went to her chest. I can't go in there. Why not? Because I'm dirty. The words came out so plainly that they silenced everyone. Annie looked down at her work shirt, the wrinkled sleeves, the small stain near the cuff, her shoes with grass on the soles from when she had stepped out earlier, and then quickly returned to the car. Shame moved across her face in a way Richard could not miss. I got off work, she said. I haven't showered. I haven't changed. I don't want to walk through your house like this. Richard looked at the house, then at Annie. The size of it embarrassed him for the first time in years. It's a house, he said, not a courtroom. For you. The answer stopped him. Dawson bent to close his tool bag and pretended not to hear. Harold looked at the lawn. Richard stood still because Annie had just named the thing money always tried to hide. Doors did not feel the same to everyone. My mother used to clean houses like this, Annie said, her voice lower now. Not yours. Houses like it. She'd come home and tell me how careful she had to be not to leave a mark. Don't touch the glass. Don't drip water on the floor. Don't sit unless they tell you. Don't look tired. Don't make them remember you're a person unless they're in the mood for it. Richard's face changed. Annie seemed to realize she had said too much. I'm sorry. He shook his head once. Stop apologizing for telling me the truth. She looked at him then, really looked, and something fragile moved between them. Not trust. Not yet. Maybe only the possibility that he was hearing her. Richard turned toward Harold. Have Mrs. Alvarez prepare the guest room off the library. Fresh towels, breakfast, and tell her Annie's belongings are to be placed exactly where Annie wants them. Harold's jaw worked. Mr. Whitmore, staff will need to know how long. As long as I say. Understood. No, Richard said. I want you to understand more than the instruction. This young woman is a guest. Annie looked down quickly, unable to hold that word. Harold gave a stiff nod and went inside. Dawson waited until the door closed. I'll call my flatbed. Take about 20 minutes. Richard nodded. Thank you. Annie reached into the back seat and pulled a worn backpack toward her. I'll take the important stuff. What counts as important? Richard asked. All of it. He accepted that without argument. Then we take all of it. She began with the photograph. Her fingers untied the ribbon slowly. carefully, as if one wrong pull could undo more than a knot. When the ribbon came free, she folded it once and placed it inside the notebook. The photograph she held against her chest for a moment before putting it in the backpack. Richard watched in silence. Next came the books, 3 of them from a used bookstore, their corners bent. Then the notebook of expenses, then the work shirt, the crackers, the jar of peanut butter, a small bag of toiletries, a folded black dress in a dry cleaner's plastic sleeve. Annie handled the dress last and held it with both hands. "My funeral dress," she said, not looking at him. "It's the only nice thing I have left." Richard's throat tightened. "We'll hang it up." She looked at him with wet eyes. "You don't have to say things like that." "What things?" "Kind things. I don't know what to do with them." He almost answered too fast, then stopped himself. Some sentences needed room. "Then don't do anything with them yet," he said. "Just hear them." Dawson stepped away to make his call. Richard stood near the car while Annie gathered the last of her life from the back seat. A comb, a phone charger, 2 pay stubs, a small bottle of her mother's hand lotion with only a little left at the bottom. She held that bottle longer than anything else. "It doesn't come out anymore," she said. "I just open it sometimes." Richard nodded. He understood more than he wanted to. When the car was empty, it looked worse somehow, not because of dirt or age, but because it had been stripped of the evidence that someone had loved it into usefulness. Annie stood beside it now, backpack on one shoulder, funeral dress over her arm, face damp, eyes tired. The front door opened again. A woman in her late 50s stepped out, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. She had gray in her dark hair and the calm posture of someone who had seen many rich men have many moods and survived all of them. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Mrs. Alvarez, this is Annie Carter." Mrs. Alvarez looked at Annie, then at the dress, the backpack, the swollen eyes, and understood enough not to ask questions. "Good morning, Annie," she said gently. "Come on in. I made eggs, toast, and coffee. There's hot water upstairs too. Whenever you're ready." Annie's face crumpled. She tried to say thank you, but it came out as a breath. Richard stepped aside, leaving a clear path to the door. Annie looked at the Buick one more time. "You promise nobody's taking it where I can't find it?" "I promise. And the ribbon stays with me." "It stays with you." She nodded and began walking toward the house with Mrs. Alvarez beside her, not touching her, only walking at the same pace. Richard remained on the lawn as Dawson returned from his call. "That girl's been carrying a lot," Dawson said quietly. Richard looked at the old Buick, then at the tire marks in the grass he had cared about so much half an hour earlier. "Yes," he said. "And I nearly added to it." Annie stopped at the threshold. It was not the size of the house that held her there, though the entrance was large enough to make her feel as if she had walked into a hotel by mistake. It was the quiet. No upstairs neighbor crossing the floor, no traffic close to the window, no voices in the hall, no engine ticking beside her. Just a cool foyer, polished wood, framed photographs, and the soft smell of coffee coming from somewhere deeper inside. Mrs. Alvarez noticed without turning it into a scene. "No rush, honey. The floor can wait." Annie looked down at her shoes. The soles were damp from the grass, and there was a dark mark near the toe of the left one. She stepped back at once. "I'm sorry. I can take them off." "You can, if that makes you comfortable," Mrs. Alvarez said, "but nobody's going to faint over a little grass." Annie bent and untied them anyway. Her fingers worked fast, almost frantic. She placed the shoes side by side outside the door, then stepped in wearing thin black socks with a small hole near one heel. When she saw it, she shifted her foot behind the other. Mrs. Alvarez pretended not to notice. Richard came in behind them and paused, watching Annie stand in his foyer with her backpack clutched in one hand and her funeral dress held over one arm. He had seen business leaders enter that house without hesitation. Senators who looked around as if measuring what they could ask from him. Donors who complimented the art. While calculating his worth, Annie looked as if the air itself had rules she had not been told. "Breakfast is in the kitchen," Mrs. Alvarez said. "You want coffee, tea, orange juice?" Annie glanced at Richard before answering. "Water is fine." "Water then, and eggs. I don't want to trouble you." Mrs. Alvarez gave her a look that was neither sharp nor soft. "Child, I've cooked for men who left half a steak on a plate because a phone call upset them. You sitting down for eggs is not trouble. Annie's mouth trembled, and she nodded. The kitchen was warm from the stove. Morning light came through wide windows over the sink, touching a bowl of oranges and a folded newspaper on the counter. Annie sat at the far edge of the table, not the middle, with her backpack tucked against her ankle and the dress laid across her lap. Mrs. Alvarez placed a plate in front of her. Scrambled eggs, toast, sliced tomato, and a little dish of grits with butter melting into the center. Annie stared at the plate. Richard saw her swallow. "You don't have to eat if you're not hungry," he said. She looked up quickly. "I am," but she still did not move. Mrs. Alvarez set a glass of water beside the plate. "Then eat before it gets cold." Annie picked up the fork. Her first bite was small, cautious, almost polite. The second was larger. By the third, she had to stop because tears came again. Sudden and embarrassing. She put the fork down and pressed her knuckles against her mouth. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Mrs. Alvarez pulled out the chair beside her but did not sit too close. "For what?" "I don't know." Annie shook her head. "For crying over eggs, I guess." Richard looked toward the window. Mrs. Alvarez said, "People cry over less honest things than eggs." That made Annie let out a broken little laugh. It vanished fast, but it was there. She wiped her face and tried another bite. Richard remained standing near the counter until Mrs. Alvarez pointed at the chair across from Annie. "Mr. Whitmore, you hovering will not improve the grits." He sat. Annie kept her eyes on the plate. For several minutes, nobody asked questions. That silence did more for her than comfort would have. She ate like someone who had trained herself to stop before she was full, then remembered she did not have to, then became ashamed of wanting more. Mrs. Alvarez noticed and placed another slice of toast near the plate without comment. Richard finally said, "Annie, I need to ask you something. You don't have to answer all of it now." She set the fork down. "Okay. How old were you when your mother started getting sick?" Annie looked at the water glass. She always had little things. Pain, swelling, tiredness. But she got real sick last winter. By January, she couldn't hide it anymore. She was still working? Yes. She said sick people still needed rent money. Annie rubbed her thumb against the edge of the table. I'd tell her to rest, and she'd say rest was for people who had already paid the light bill. Mrs. Alvarez turned away toward the sink, but Richard saw her shoulders tighten. "What hospital?" he asked. "Grady first. Then a specialist. Then back again." There were forms and payment plans and people saying words I didn't understand. Dialysis. Infection markers. Charity review. Outstanding balance. Annie gave a tired shake of the head. Every office had a different window. Every window had somebody telling me to sit down and wait. Richard's jaw tightened, not at her, but at the familiarity of systems that made exhausted people prove their exhaustion in triplicate. "Did your landlord know?" he asked. "That she was sick? That you were trying to pay?" Annie looked at him then. He knew enough to put a notice on the door. The answer had no anger in it. That was what made it land. "I begged him for 2 more weeks, she said. "I had a paycheck coming. Not enough, but something. He said he had been patient. Maybe he had. I don't know. I just remember standing in the hallway with that paper in my hand, thinking, where do people go when a door stops being theirs?" Richard did not speak. Annie picked at the corner of the toast. Mama was already gone by then. Funeral home wanted money. Hospital wanted money. Landlord wanted money. Everybody wanted money from a girl who had 3 uniforms, 1 car, and a purse full of receipts. Mrs. Alvarez came back to the table and placed a folded cloth napkin near Annie's hand. Annie took it and whispered, "Thank you." Richard said, "You should have had help." Annie gave him a look that was not bitter, just tired. People always say that after the part where help would have mattered. He accepted the blow because it was true. Outside, the sound of a truck came through the windows. Dawson's flatbed was arriving. Annie turned sharply toward the sound, chair legs scraping the floor. Richard stood at once. "It's the mechanic." She grabbed the backpack. "I want to see." "Come on." She followed him out through the front door, still holding the funeral dress, bare feet moving carefully across the foyer until Mrs. Alvarez appeared with her shoes. "Honey, shoes." Annie looked embarrassed. "Right." She slipped them on without tying them and hurried outside. The flatbed had stopped at the edge of the driveway. Dawson was guiding the driver with one hand while looking at the Buick with more care than judgment. He saw Annie and called, "Nothing happens until you say so." Annie walked to the car. She touched the hood once. "Can I ride with it?" Dawson nodded. "Sure can. Passenger seat in the truck." She looked at Richard. "You said just the mechanic." "And that's still true," Richard said. "You go with the car. I'll follow." "Why?" "Because I want to." She studied him, searching for the hook in the offer. "You have work. I own the company. They can start without me." That answer seemed impossible to her, but not cruel. The driver lowered the ramp. As Dawson prepared the Buick, Annie opened the driver's door and leaned inside one more time. The car was almost empty now. Without the blanket and books and paper bag, it looked older, frailer. She ran her fingers across the steering wheel where the ribbon had been. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered. Richard heard it and looked away, giving her the privacy of a grief that had no walls. A few minutes later, the Buick was secured on the flatbed. Annie climbed into the passenger seat of the service truck with her backpack on her lap. Richard stood beside his driveway, robe still tied wrong, coffee long forgotten, and watched the truck begin to roll toward the gate. Harold appeared behind him. "Sir, your Denver call has been moved twice." Richard did not look back. "Move it again. There may be consequences." Richard watched Annie turn in the truck seat to keep the Buick in sight through the rear window. "There usually are," he said. The gate opened, and the flatbed carried the old car out toward the road. For a moment, tire marks were all that remained on the grass. That morning, Richard had thought those marks were damage. Now they looked more like evidence. Proof that someone had reached his door carrying a story he had been too angry to read. Dawson's garage sat behind a row of brick storefronts on a side street off Peachtree Industrial, the kind of place easy to miss unless you already knew it was there. No sign shouted for attention. No flags waved. The building had 3 bay doors, a small office with Venetian blinds, and a coffee machine inside that looked older than some of the cars it served. Richard parked beside the flatbed and stepped out just as Annie climbed down from the passenger seat, clutching her backpack to her chest. She went straight to the Buick. Dawson was already loosening the straps. "Careful now. Let me get her on the ground before you start loving on her." Annie stopped at once. "Sorry. Didn't say you did wrong," Dawson said. "Just don't want your toes under a tire." Richard watched her face. Every correction landed on Annie as if it might become punishment. She had learned to hear danger in ordinary voices. He wondered how long a person had to live that way before even kindness sounded like a test. The Buick rolled slowly off the flatbed and into the first bay. Its tires touched the concrete with a tired squeak. Annie followed it inside, staying a few feet back, eyes fixed on the car the way people look at hospital doors when someone they love has been taken behind them. Dawson lifted the hood again. "I'll check the battery, fuel pressure, starter connections, plugs, belts, all of it. Could be simple, could be stubborn. These old girls like attention." "How much?" Annie asked. Richard answered before Dawson could. "Don't worry about that." She turned to him quickly. "I have to worry about that." "No, you don't." "Yes, I do." Her voice shook, but she did not lower it. "People keep saying don't worry when they mean don't ask. I'm asking." Dawson looked down into the engine as if suddenly fascinated by a hose clamp. Richard took a breath. "There will be no charge to you." Annie's eyes reddened again. "That's a charge. It just comes later." "No, you don't know that. I do." She wiped her face with her sleeve, angry at the tears. "I've had people help me and then remind me. I've had people give me 2 nights on a couch and then talk about me like I stole the roof. I've had a landlord say he understood, right before he taped paper to the door. I can't take something if I don't know what it costs." Richard let her finish. The old version of him would have cut her off. The man from that morning would have told her not to be dramatic. But standing in Dawson's garage, with Margaret Carter's daughter trembling beside a car that would not start, he understood that Annie was not arguing over money. She was defending the last border she still controlled. "All right," he said. "Then we'll write it down." She blinked. "What?" "The cost. Dawson will write the cost. I will pay it. You will owe me nothing. If you need the words on paper, I'll put them on paper." Annie looked unsure. "Why would you do that?" "Because your mother once paid for me when I couldn't pay for myself." That was her, Annie said. Not me. I know. So why do I get the help? Because she isn't here to receive it. Annie looked down. Her mouth tightened, and the tears came again. Quieter this time. That doesn't feel fair. No, Richard said. It doesn't. Dawson cleared his throat gently. There's a little office over there. Coffee's bad, but it's hot. Chairs don't bite. This may take a while. Annie looked at the Buick. Can I stay where I can see it? Doors open, Dawson said. The office had a small table, 2 chairs, old racing calendars on the wall, and a window looking into the bay. Annie sat facing the car. Richard sat across from her, still in the robe he had forgotten he was wearing until 2 mechanics walked past and pretended not to notice. He should have felt ridiculous. Instead, he felt stripped of the armor his suits usually gave him. Annie placed her backpack on her lap. She opened it and checked inside. Notebook, ribbon, photograph, lotion bottle, pay stubs, folded dress. Then she closed it. Richard noticed. You count your things often? She gave him a tired look. When you carry everything, you check everything. He nodded. Dawson brought 2 paper cups of coffee and 1 packet of crackers from the vending machine. On the house, he said. Annie looked at the crackers. I can pay for those. Dawson put the packet on the table. I know. I'm still giving them to you. She stared at the small package for a moment before taking it. Thank you. When Dawson left, Richard said, Tell me about school. Annie turned the crackers in her hand without opening them. I graduated in May. This year? She nodded. Mama was in the hospital. She made the nurse help her watch the ceremony on my phone. The signal kept freezing. Every time it froze, Mama said, That's all right. Gives me more time to be proud. Richard looked at the bay window because Annie's face made it hard to look anywhere else. She wanted me to go to Georgia State, Annie said. I got accepted. Not full scholarship, but some aid. I was going to study business. Maybe accounting. I like numbers because they don't lie unless people make them. That's a good reason. I deferred. I told them family emergency. That sounds cleaner than broke. What would it take to go back? She looked at him sharply. Don't. I'm asking. No, you're measuring. Rich people ask questions like they're opening a drawer. Richard leaned back in his chair. Fair. She looked surprised he admitted it. I wasn't always rich, he said. Annie's eyes moved over the robe, the watch on his wrist, the car keys on the table. That must have been a long time ago. It was. Then maybe you forgot. The words were not cruel. They were worse. They were accurate. Richard folded his hands. I did. Annie's expression changed a little. He looked through the office window at the Buick. When I was 24, I came to Atlanta chasing work. I had 1 bag, a folder of resumes, and enough cash to last a few days. A man told me he could get me an interview if I paid a fee. I was hungry enough to believe him. He robbed you? Not with a gun, with a smile. Annie looked down. That happens too. Yes, it does. I ended up near the bus station with no money. Your mother was working that block. She gave you food. Half her lunch. Bus fare too. Annie opened the crackers at last, but did not eat. She never told me. She probably forgot me by dinner. No. Annie shook her head. Mama didn't forget people. She just didn't brag. Richard looked at her. She said something to me that day. I told her I'd pay her back. She said, pay it forward when life gives you the chance. Annie's eyes filled again, but this time she smiled through it, small and painful. She said that all the time. Used to get on my nerves. She was right. She usually was. Annie wiped her cheek. I hated that too. For a moment, the garage office held them gently. Not healed. Not solved. Just 2 people sitting with the same woman between them, one who had lived poor and given anyway. Dawson tapped on the glass, then opened the office door. Good news and regular news. Annie stood too fast. Is it dead? No, ma'am. Battery is done. Terminals are bad. Belt needs replacing. Plugs are tired. Fuel filter's nasty. She needs work. But she's not dead. Annie pressed a hand to her mouth. She can run? She can run. Richard saw her shoulders shake once. She turned away, embarrassed, but Dawson kindly pretended to check his clipboard. How long? Richard asked. If I put 2 men on it, by tomorrow afternoon. If we order a couple parts fast, maybe sooner. Annie looked at Richard in alarm. Tomorrow? Where am I supposed to? She stopped herself. The sentence hung there. Richard stood. The guest room is ready. Annie shook her head. I can't stay in your house. You can. I don't know you. You knew my better creditor. She frowned through tears. What does that mean? It means your mother gave me more than I deserved, and she charged me nothing. I'm asking you to accept one safe night while your car is repaired. One night? One night. Door locks. Mrs. Alvarez is there. You can leave whenever you choose. Annie looked through the window at the Buick, then down at her backpack. Her voice became small again. I'm tired. I know. I mean really tired. I know. She nodded once, not quite agreeing, not quite surrendering, just too worn down to keep standing alone. Richard picked up his keys. Then let's go back. Annie looked at Dawson. You'll call if anything changes? I'll call, he said. And nobody touches that ribbon. She held the backpack closer. Richard opened the office door for her. Annie walked through slowly, as if every doorway still needed permission. Outside, the morning had warmed, and traffic moved beyond the garage like the city had no idea anything important had happened. Before getting into Richard's car, Annie looked back at the open bay. The Buick sat under the shop lights with its hood raised, old and tired, but not finished. For the first time all morning, so did she. The ride back to Richard's house was quiet for the first mile. Annie sat in the passenger seat with her backpack on her lap, and both hands wrapped around it. She had buckled the seatbelt slowly, as if afraid to touch the wrong thing. Richard's car smelled faintly of leather and coffee, and the dashboard had more buttons than she cared to understand. She kept her eyes on the road, counting familiar things whenever she could find them. A gas station, a church sign, a bus stop, a woman walking a small dog near a pharmacy. Ordinary things helped. Ordinary things did not ask questions. Richard glanced at her once. Are you cold? No, sir. You can adjust the air. I'm fine. He left it alone. At the next red light, Annie looked down at her work shirt and pressed her fingers over the stain near the cuff. I should call my manager. Richard handed her his phone before thinking. She stared at it. It's just a phone, he said. It's probably worth more than my rent used to be. Probably not. She gave him a look. All right, he said. Maybe. The corner of her mouth moved. Almost a smile, but it did not stay. She took the phone with two hands and dialed from memory. Richard listened without pretending not to. Mr. Cole? It's Annie. I'm sorry I missed your call. No, I didn't quit. My car broke down after my shift. Yes, sir, I understand. I can still come in tonight if you need me. I know. I know it looks bad. No, sir, it won't happen again. Her face tightened. Richard gripped the steering wheel. No, I don't have the uniform with me right now, but I can get it. Yes, sir. Thank you for not taking me off the schedule. Thank you. She ended the call and held the phone out. He threatened your job? Richard asked. He said if I miss tonight, he'll give my hours to someone else. You worked last night. That's why they call it work. Richard did not like the answer because there was no self-pity in it, only fact. You can't go in tonight. I can. You haven't slept. I slept some. In a car that wouldn't start. She turned toward the window. I don't have the kind of life where tired gets a vote. Richard heard Margaret in that too, though he wished he had not. When they reached the house, Annie paused again before entering, but less than before. Mrs. Alvarez met them in the foyer with a stack of folded towels and a face that knew better than to ask too much at once. The room's ready, she said. Bathroom's right across the hall. I put a robe on the hook and some clean clothes on the chair. They may not fit perfect, but they'll do until we wash yours. Annie looked overwhelmed by the towels. I can wash my own clothes. I believe you, Mrs. Alvarez said. The washer's still available. That answer seemed to help. Richard said, I'll be in my office. Annie looked at him quickly. Do I need to sign anything? No. Do I need to give you my ID? No. Do you want my phone number? Only if you want me to have it. She frowned. Not from suspicion this time, but confusion. People usually ask for something. Richard's voice softened. Then let's not do usual today. Mrs. Alvarez led Annie down a hall lined with framed photographs of places Richard had purchased, renovated, sold, or renamed. Annie did not know that. To her, they were only buildings that looked too expensive to enter. The guest room sat off the library. with a queen bed, a small writing desk, a lamp, and curtains the color of cream. A vase of fresh flowers stood on the dresser. Annie stopped when she saw them. Mrs. Alvarez followed her eyes. Too much? Annie shook her head. No. My mama liked flowers. She'd buy the half-dead ones at Kroger when they marked them down and say they just needed somebody to believe in them for 3 more days. Mrs. Alvarez smiled faintly. Smart woman. She was. The bathroom across the hall had white towels, soap still in paper, and a shower with glass doors. Annie stood inside it for a long moment after Mrs. Alvarez left. She locked the bathroom door, then checked it twice. The sound of running water startled her when she turned the handle. Hot water came fast. She held her hand beneath it until steam rose around her wrist. Then she cried, not loudly. She had learned not to cry loudly in apartments with thin walls, hospital rooms with open curtains, and cars parked where strangers might knock. She cried with one hand pressed over her mouth and the other holding the edge of the sink. There was no single reason for it. It was the food, the car, the photograph, Richard's apology, Dawson saying the Buick was not dead, Mrs. Alvarez calling the room ready. It was all too much because for months she had survived by making every need small. And now the smallest kindness felt like a weight she could not carry. When she stepped under the shower, she stood without moving. Water ran through her hair, down her face, over the work shirt she had forgotten to take off in the first second, because exhaustion made even simple things slow. She laughed once, broken and embarrassed, then peeled the shirt away and let the water do what sleep had not. Down the hall, Richard stood in his office and did not take the Denver call. His assistant had sent 3 messages. Harold had sent 2, both written in the stiff language of concern. The investors were waiting. The contract could move without him, but not smoothly. Normally, that would have been enough to pull him back into himself. This morning, it was not. He sat behind his desk but did not open the laptop. Instead, he looked at a framed photograph on the far shelf. His mother, dead 12 years now, stood in front of a small brick house in Macon, wearing a church hat and holding a paper plate at a picnic. He had not thought of her when Annie first said she had no home. He was ashamed of that. He thought of her now. His mother had cleaned offices for 21 years. She had kept a spare pair of shoes in the trunk because one pair always got wet. She had raised him to say yes ma'am and no sir even to people who did not deserve the courtesy. When he became rich, he told himself he had honored her by never needing to scrub another floor. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that honoring the poor did not mean escaping them. It meant remembering how close you once stood. A knock came at the office door. Mrs. Alvarez stepped in. She's in the shower. Richard nodded. Thank you, she cried. He looked up. I didn't listen, she said. The walls did. Richard looked down at his hands. I don't know what I'm doing. That may be the first sensible thing you've said today. He almost smiled. You don't approve? I approve of feeding hungry people and not towing their cars. The rest depends on what you do next. What do you think I should do? Mrs. Alvarez took her time. She had worked in the house 8 years, long enough to know when Richard wanted advice and when he wanted confirmation. This was not confirmation. Do not turn her into a project, she said. Do not make her grateful on a schedule. Do not ask her to heal fast because you feel guilty. Give the girl a door she can close, food she doesn't have to earn, and choices she can refuse. Richard listened. And Harold? He asked. Mrs. Alvarez's face cooled. Harold will smile while doing whatever he thinks protects the house from people like her. Richard leaned back. People like her. That's how he'll say it without saying it. He knew she was right. Harold believed in order above mercy, and he had served Richard well because Richard had often believed the same. I'll handle Harold, Richard said. See that you do. She left him with the sentence. Annie came down nearly an hour later wearing a plain gray sweatshirt and dark drawstring pants Mrs. Alvarez had found in a storage closet from some charity drive Richard had sponsored and forgotten. Her hair was damp, her face scrubbed clean, and she looked younger without the work shirt and the fear sharpened by the lawn. She held her backpack in front of her with both hands. Richard stood when she entered the kitchen. She noticed. You don't have to do that. My mother would disagree. Annie looked at him, unsure whether to smile. Mine too. Mrs. Alvarez set a bowl of chicken soup and rice on the table. Eat, then sleep. I need to go to work tonight, Annie said. Richard sat across from her. You need to sleep. My manager said. I heard. Then you heard I can't lose the hours. Richard chose his words carefully. What if the hours were covered? Her face closed. Covered how? I can call your manager. No. Annie. No. The word came out firmer this time. Please don't call him. Please don't make me look like some charity case with a rich man speaking for me. I need that job. I need him to see me as someone who shows up. Richard stopped. Mrs. Alvarez gave him a look from the stove that said, Listen. All right, he said. I won't call. Annie's shoulders eased by an inch. But I can ask a question, he said. Not as your boss. Not as his. Just to you. If you go in tonight without sleep, what happens tomorrow? She looked at the soup. Steam moved across her face. Tomorrow happens anyway. That isn't an answer. It's the only one I've had. Richard let that sit. Take one night. Call him yourself. Tell him your car is in the shop and you are sick from exhaustion. That's true enough. If he fires you for one night, then it was never stable enough to save you. Annie looked at him with misty-eyed anger. Easy to say when you have a house like this. Yes, Richard said. It is easy for me to say. That doesn't make it wrong. She looked away. Mrs. Alvarez placed a spoon beside the bowl. Eat first. Decide after. Annie picked up the spoon. She ate slowly now, not as desperate as before, but still with the careful habit of someone measuring each bite. Halfway through, her eyelids grew heavy. She tried to hide it. Richard noticed and said nothing. After the bowl was empty, Annie stood. I'm just going to sit upstairs for a minute. Mrs. Alvarez nodded. Of course. Annie looked at Richard. You'll call Dawson if he calls? Yes. And the car stays there? Yes. And Harold won't touch it. She held his eyes for a moment, then nodded. Okay. She walked upstairs with her backpack. The bedroom door closed a minute later. Softly but firmly. Richard heard the lock turn. Mrs. Alvarez began clearing the bowl. Good. Richard looked toward the staircase. The lock? The fact that she used it. He understood. In the quiet that followed, Richard's phone vibrated again. Denver. Investors. Numbers. Property. Deadlines. The world he had built was still waiting, impatient as ever. He silenced the phone and looked out the kitchen window toward the driveway, where the tire marks remained in the grass. For the first time that day, he did not see damage. He saw where the truth had entered. Annie slept for 4 hours and woke as if she had done something wrong. For a few seconds she did not know where she was. The ceiling was too high, the bed too soft, the air too quiet. Then she saw her backpack on the chair, her funeral dress hanging inside the closet with the plastic sleeve still over it, and the photograph of her mother propped against the lamp. She had placed it there before lying down, then locked the door and slept in her clothes because changing felt like admitting she might stay. She sat up fast and reached for the backpack. Notebook, ribbon, lotion bottle, pay stubs, phone charger, all there. Only then did she breathe. Her phone had 3 missed calls from work and 1 text from Mr. Cole. Need answer by 4 or I cover your shift. Annie looked at the time, 3:38. She pressed the phone to her chest and closed her eyes. Sleep had not made the world easier. It had only moved the trouble a few hours down the road. Downstairs, Richard sat in his office with Harold Benson standing across from the desk. Harold had waited until Annie was asleep to say what he had been holding since morning. I understand the emotional connection, Harold said. I do, but this is exactly how situations get out of hand. Richard looked at him over a folder he had not read. You understand the emotional connection? I understand that the woman in the photograph once helped you. Her name was Margaret Carter. Yes, sir, Margaret Carter. Harold gave the name the proper amount of respect and no warmth. But the daughter is still a stranger. She arrived on your property in a non-functioning vehicle, admitted she has no residence, and now she is inside the house. Staff are aware. Dawson is aware. If this becomes known, it could raise questions. Questions from whom? Board members, investors, neighbors, press, if anyone decides to make it one of those stories. One of what stories? Harold paused. He knew tone mattered with Richard. A story about a wealthy man and a homeless young woman. People enjoy twisting generosity into scandal. Richard's eyes narrowed. Is that concern for me or disgust for her? Harold straightened. It is concern for the household. The household has survived worse than a guest room being used. This is not a guest in the ordinary sense. No, Richard said. It is someone who needed help, and help can be provided through proper channels. Richard closed the folder. Proper channels told her to wait while her mother died. Harold's face tightened, but he did not stop. Then, give money to a foundation. Establish a grant. Make a call. You do not need to bring this girl into your private residence. Richard stood slowly. This girl has a name. Annie, Harold said too quickly. Use it like you mean it. Silence moved across the office. Harold lowered his voice. Mr. Whitmore, I have served this house for 9 years. My job is to see risks before they become consequences. You are reacting from guilt. I am trying to protect you from a decision made in a moment. Richard looked toward the window. From the office, he could still see the faint tire marks in the lawn. Groundskeeping had already asked whether they should repair them. He had said no. You may be right about one thing, Richard said. I am reacting from guilt. That doesn't mean I'm wrong. A knock came at the office door before Harold could answer. Mrs. Alvarez stepped in, holding the cordless house phone. Dawson on line 2, she said. And Annie is awake. Richard reached for the phone. Thank you. Mrs. Alvarez did not leave. Her eyes moved once to Harold, then back to Richard. She had heard enough from the hall to know what kind of conversation had been taking place. Richard picked up. Dawson. The mechanic's voice came through low and rough. She'll run by tomorrow. But I need your approval on the work. You have it. You haven't heard the price. I said you have it. All right. Battery, belt, plugs, filters, fuel pump, tires soon, but not today unless you tell me. Also, there's a coolant leak. Small. I'd fix it before it becomes large. Fix it. Dawson paused. You planning to give this car back to her patched or fixed? Richard looked at Harold. Fixed. That'll cost. I know what fixed means. Good. Because that girl doesn't need a car that starts just long enough to break her heart on the next corner. Richard's voice softened. Call me when it's done. He hung up. Harold said, May I ask what that repair will cost? No. Sir, no. The office door opened wider. Annie stood just outside, one hand on the doorframe, hair still damp from the earlier shower, face pale from sleep and worry. She had clearly heard enough to know money was being discussed. How much? She asked. Richard turned to her. You don't need to worry about that. Her face crumpled at once. Please don't say that. Mrs. Alvarez stepped toward her. Honey, sit down. Annie shook her head. No, I need to know. If it's too much, don't fix everything. Just whatever makes it start. I can save for the rest. I don't need tires. I don't need anything extra. Harold looked at Richard as if Annie had proved his point. Richard said, Dawson says it needs more than a quick start. Then I'll take it somewhere cheaper. With what money? Harold asked. The question came out before Richard could stop him. Annie went still. Harold seemed to realize he had spoken too plainly, so he adjusted his tone. I mean practically, Miss Carter. You said yourself you have very little cash. A lower quality repair may not serve you. Annie's eyes filled, but her voice was quiet. You don't have to dress it up. You mean I'm broke? Harold said nothing. Richard's voice cut across the room. Harold, leave. Mr. Whitmore. Now. Harold closed his mouth, gave a short nod, and walked past Annie without looking at her. Mrs. Alvarez watched him go, then followed to give them privacy. Annie stayed by the door. I didn't mean to listen. You weren't wrong to. I can't pay for all that. I know. Then don't do all that. Annie. No, please listen. She stepped into the office, gripping the sleeves of the sweatshirt Mrs. Alvarez had given her. I know what people think when they see me like this. They think I don't understand money because I don't have any. I understand money. I know exactly what $5 does. I know what gas costs by the quarter tank. I know how long peanut butter lasts if you don't eat too much at once. I know how to choose between phone service and laundry. So if that repair is hundreds of dollars, maybe more, then that's not nothing. That's someone's rent. That's a month of groceries. That's a hospital bill they send 3 times in red ink. Richard stood behind his desk, hearing every word. I'm not trying to be ungrateful, she said. I just can't have you spending that kind of money because you feel bad about my mama. I don't feel bad about your mother. She looked hurt. I feel ashamed of myself, he said. There's a difference. Annie blinked. Why? Because this morning I treated her car like trash before I knew whose memories were inside it. Her mouth trembled. You didn't know. That excuse is ignorance, not cruelty. She looked down. Richard came around the desk but stopped several feet away, giving her room. Dawson is going to fix the car properly. Not because I think you can't take care of yourself. You already proved you can. Better than most people I know. I'm doing it because your mother gave me one good day when I had none left, and I have carried that debt badly for a long time. Annie wiped her cheek. Mama wouldn't call it a debt. No, she probably wouldn't. Then why do you? Because I'm not as good as she was. That answer seemed to take the strength out of her. She sat in the chair near the bookcase, not gracefully, just tired. I don't know what to do. About the car? About any of this. Richard sat across from her. What do you need to do first? She looked at her phone. Call work. If I don't answer, they'll cover my shift. Do you want the shift? I need it. That isn't what I asked. She stared at the phone. Her eyes filled again, but she looked angry at the tears. No, I want to sleep. I want one night where I'm not afraid somebody's going to knock on the window. I want to wake up and not count coins before I brush my teeth, but wanting things doesn't pay for them. Richard nodded. Call him. Tell him the truth you choose to tell, and no more. She dialed with shaking hands and put the phone to her ear. Mr. Cole? It's Annie. I'm sorry. My car is in the shop, and I can't make tonight's shift. She paused. Her eyes closed. Yes, sir, I understand. No, I'm not quitting. I can come tomorrow if the car is ready. Yes, sir. Thank you. She ended the call. Richard waited. He gave away tonight, she said. Said tomorrow depends. I'm sorry. She gave a small nod, though her face showed what one lost shift meant. Mrs. Alvarez appeared in the doorway. Soup's still warm. There's also cornbread. Annie looked up, embarrassed by how quickly hunger crossed her face. Richard stood. Eat first. Annie rose slowly. At the door, she stopped and looked back into the office. Mr. Whitmore? Yes? Harold thinks I'm trouble. Richard did not lie. Yes. Is he right? He looked at her for a moment. No. But he may become some if I don't watch him. Annie absorbed that. People like him usually win. Not in my house. She did not answer, but something in her eyes asked whether his house was enough to change anything outside of it. Richard had no answer yet. That evening, after Annie ate and returned upstairs, Harold stood alone near the side porch, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low. Yes, he said. The girl is still here. No, he isn't thinking clearly. The car is at Dawson's. I want it removed from the property records and handled before this becomes a problem. He listened, eyes on the darkening lawn. I don't care how you do it, Harold said. Just make sure that car doesn't come back here. By morning, Annie had folded the borrowed sweatshirt and pants at the foot of the guest bed even though Mrs. Alvarez had told her not to bother. She had slept in short pieces, waking each time the house made a sound. The air system starting, a pipe settling, a car passing outside the gate. Each time she reached for her backpack, touched the ribbon inside, then checked the chair where her mother's photograph rested against the lamp. At 7, Mrs. Alvarez knocked once. Annie, breakfast when you're ready. Annie opened the door almost at once. Her hair was brushed back, her face clean, but her eyes still carried the look of someone listening for bad news. I didn't know if I should come down, she said. Mrs. Alvarez held a mug of tea. Honey, if someone feeds you supper and gives you a bed, breakfast is usually included. Annie took the mug with both hands. Thank you. You keep saying that like every cup of tea comes with paperwork. Sometimes it does. Mrs. Alvarez's face softened. Not in my kitchen. Downstairs. Richard was already at the table, dressed now in a navy sweater and slacks, looking more like the man the world knew, and less like the angry stranger from the lawn. A newspaper lay folded beside him, untouched. He stood when Annie entered. She stopped. You really don't have to stand every time. I know. Then why do you? Because I was raised right and forgot it for a while. Annie looked down, unsure what to do with that answer, and sat across from him. Mrs. Alvarez placed oatmeal, toast, and sliced peaches on the table. Annie ate slowly, but not as if she needed permission for every bite. That small change did not escape Richard. His phone buzzed beside the newspaper. Dawson's name appeared on the screen. Richard answered. "Morning, Dawson." Annie's hand froze over the spoon. Dawson's voice came through low enough that Richard turned on speaker and placed the phone between them. "Car's coming along. She'll run." "But I got something odd." Annie leaned forward. "What's wrong?" "Nothing mechanical this time. A man called the shop last night asking about the Buick. Said he was authorized by Mr. Whitmore's office to arrange transfer to a salvage yard." Annie's face drained. Richard's expression hardened. "Who called?" "Didn't give a name at first," then said Benson. Mrs. Alvarez stopped moving near the counter. Annie stood so quickly the chair scraped the floor. "Salvage yard?" Dawson said. "Now, nobody moved anything. I didn't like the smell of it. I told him I don't release a vehicle without the owner's say-so, and as far as I'm concerned, the owner is the young lady whose hands were shaking over that steering wheel." Annie covered her mouth. He tried to get rid of it. Richard rose. "Thank you, Dawson. Keep the car locked inside. If anyone calls again, send them to me." "Already done." The line ended. Annie's breath turned uneven. "I knew it." Richard looked at her. "Annie, I knew it." Her voice broke, and she stepped back from the table. "I knew someone would decide it was easier if the car disappeared. That's what people do. They call it cleaning up. They call it procedure. They call it whatever makes them feel decent." Richard moved around the table, then stopped when he saw her flinch. "I didn't authorize that." "I know you didn't." She was crying now, angry and hurt at the same time. "That's the part that scares me. You can say one thing, and somebody else with keys and phone numbers can do another. I told you. I told you people don't listen when you're not looking." Mrs. Alvarez came closer. "Annie, sit down before you fall over." "I can't sit." Annie pressed both hands against her chest. "That car is not junk. I know it looks ugly to people. I know the paint is bad, and the engine sounds like it's coughing up gravel. But my mama drove me to school in that car. She sang in that car. She kept napkins in the glove box because she said a woman should always be ready for a spill or a blessing. When she got too sick to drive, she sat in the passenger seat and told me when to brake, like I was 12 years old again." Her voice cracked. Richard did not interrupt. "She died before I could fix the seat where the fabric tore," Annie said. "I kept saying I'd do it when I had money. I kept saying later. Then there wasn't a later. So yes, I sleep in it. Yes, I keep my clothes in it. Yes, sometimes I sit in it just to smell the old coffee in the cup holder because it makes me feel like if I turn my head fast enough, she'll be there telling me to stop crying and check the mirrors." The room went still. Annie wiped her face, but the tears kept coming. "If that car goes to a salvage yard, they won't just crush metal. They'll crush the last place I heard my mother laugh." Richard looked toward the hall. "Harold." His voice carried through the house with a force Annie had not heard before. It was not the shouting from the lawn. That had been anger without aim. This was command. Harold appeared after a moment, jacket buttoned, face composed. "Sir?" Richard held up the phone. "Did you call Dawson's garage?" Harold did not look at Annie. "I made an inquiry. You instructed him to send her car to a salvage yard. I attempted to prevent a situation from worsening." Annie let out a small sound, almost a sob. "By throwing away my mother's car?" Harold finally looked at her. "Miss Carter, no one is trying to hurt you, but sentiment does not change facts. The vehicle is in poor condition. You have no stable address. Mr. Whitmore has responsibilities, and this household cannot become a shelter every time someone arrives with a sad story." Mrs. Alvarez's face went cold. "Careful, Harold." He ignored her. "I am being careful. Someone has to be." Richard stepped closer. "You went behind my back. I acted in your best interest. You acted against a direct order. I acted because you are emotionally compromised." Richard's jaw tightened. "And you thought that gave you authority?" "I thought it gave me responsibility." Annie stood beside the table, crying openly now, not from weakness but from the wound of being discussed like a mess on a schedule. "I never asked to stay in your house," she said to Harold. "I never asked for any of this. I just asked for 2 minutes to start the car." Harold's expression barely changed, and yet here we are. The sentence landed cruelly. Richard turned to him. "Enough." Harold looked at Richard, perhaps expecting the old rules to return. the ones where order mattered most and discomfort could be removed before it became visible. Richard did not give him that. "Pack your office," Richard said. Harold blinked. "Sir, you no longer work in this house." The room held its breath. Harold's face stiffened. "You are dismissing me over this?" "I am dismissing you because a young woman was sleeping in a car on my lawn and your first instinct was to erase the car, not understand the person. With respect, you will regret this." Richard's voice lowered. "I already regret not doing it sooner." Harold looked at Annie once, not with apology, but with resentment dressed as dignity. Then he turned and walked out. Annie sank into the chair as if her legs had finally given up. Mrs. Alvarez sat beside her and placed a hand near hers on the table, not touching until Annie allowed it. After a moment, Annie reached for her. "I'm sorry," Annie whispered. Mrs. Alvarez squeezed her hand. "You apologize one more time for someone else being cruel, and I'm going to start charging you $1. A broken laugh came through Annie's tears. Richard stood across from them, feeling the cost of the morning settle into him. He had thought the apology on the lawn was enough to begin repairing what he had done. Now he understood that cruelty did not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it came in a pressed suit, using words like responsibility and procedure. He looked at Annie. "Your car will come back." She wiped her cheeks. "You can't promise what everybody will do." "No," Richard said, "but I can promise what I will do." She looked at him, still shaking. "And I can put it in writing," he added. That made her pause. Richard went to the desk in the small room off the kitchen and returned with a sheet of paper. He wrote by hand, slowly, so she could see every word. The Buick belonged to Annie Carter. No repairs, transfer, storage, disposal, or release would occur without her consent. All repair costs were paid by Richard Whitmore with no repayment required. He signed it and placed the pen beside her. Annie read the page twice. Her tears fell on the corner of the paper. "You really mean this?" "Yes." She touched the signature, then the words her consent. "Nobody ever puts my choice in writing." Richard's throat tightened. "Then we start there." Annie folded the paper carefully and slid it into her notebook with the ribbon and photograph. She held the notebook against her chest, eyes closed, as if paper could become shelter when the right words were written on it. Outside, the tire marks still crossed the lawn, but nobody spoke of fixing them. Not that morning. Not while Annie sat at the kitchen table with her mother's name safe in her backpack and, for the first time in months, one promise she could hold in her hands. After Harold left, the house felt different. Not quieter exactly, because Harold had never been a loud man. His presence had been the kind that arranged silence around itself. He made staff lower their voices, made deliveries move through side doors, made trouble disappear before Richard had to decide whether it was trouble at all. With him gone, the kitchen seemed to breathe. Mrs. Alvarez opened a window over the sink. Morning air came in carrying the smell of wet grass and cut boxwood. Annie sat with the folded paper in her notebook, one hand resting on top of it as if someone might still reach across the table and take it back. Richard poured coffee he did not want. "You should keep the original. I'll have my attorney draft something cleaner." Annie looked up. "Cleaner how?" "Lego language." Her face changed. He caught it. "Plain language too." "Both. I'll make sure it says the same thing, because legal words can hide things." "Yes," Richard said, "they can." That answer seemed to steady her more than reassurance would have. She had no use for a man pretending the world was simple. Mrs. Alvarez set fresh coffee near Richard and warm tea near Annie. "You need food before legal language ruins your stomach." Annie tried to smile. "Yes, ma'am." Richard sat across from her. "Dawson will call when the car is ready. Until then, you can stay here." Annie's fingers tightened around the mug. "I don't know how to do that." "Stay. Be here." She looked toward the hall, then back to the table. In a house like this, with people bringing towels and fixing cars and writing papers, I keep waiting for the part where someone says I misunderstood. "You didn't. I want to believe that, but you don't." She shook her head. "Not yet." Richard nodded. "Fair." That word made her look at him. "You say fair like it matters." "It should. Fair didn't keep Mama alive." No one answered right away. Annie looked down, embarrassed by the sharpness in her own voice. "I'm sorry." Mrs. Alvarez pointed a butter knife at her from the counter. "$1. Annie blinked. "You apologize for telling the truth. That's $1. For the first time since the lawn, Annie laughed. It was small and wet around the edges, but it was real enough to change the room. "I don't have $1, she said. Mrs. Alvarez nodded. "Then you owe me honesty instead." Richard watched them and felt a strange ache. In his world, people measured power by who could enter a room and make others adjust. Mrs. Alvarez had just done what money could not do. She had given Annie a rule that did not punish her. The house phone rang, and Mrs. Alvarez picked it up. "Whitmore residence." She listened, then turned to Richard. "Dawson." Richard took the phone. "Tell me." Dawson's voice carried enough that Annie leaned forward. "Car starts. Still rough, but she starts. Fuel pump was worse than I thought. I replaced it. Batteries new, belts new, plugs and filters done, coolant leak handled. Tires are safe enough for short driving, but I'd replace them within a month." Annie closed her eyes. Richard said, "Can she drive it back?" "She can, but I'd rather bring it. Less strain. Also, there's something in the glove box I didn't touch. Looks personal. I locked the car after I saw it." Annie sat straighter. "What thing?" Richard repeated the question. "A small envelope," Dawson said. "Had Margaret Carter written on it. It was tucked behind the owner's manual. Could have been there years." Annie stood so fast the chair moved back. Richard said, "We're coming." Annie grabbed her backpack, then stopped. "I need shoes." Mrs. Alvarez was already reaching for them near the kitchen door. "Here." In the car on the way to the garage, Annie held the backpack tighter than before. Richard drove himself. He had offered to let her sit in silence, and she had accepted without saying so. After several minutes, she asked, "Do you think Mama left that for me?" "I don't know. She would have told me. Maybe she meant to." Annie looked out the window. "She meant to do a lot of things." Richard heard no accusation in it, only the cruelty of unfinished time. At Dawson's garage, the Buick sat outside the first bay with the hood closed. It looked the same from a distance, old paint and tired body, but something about it seemed more alert. Annie walked toward it slowly, as if she did not want to frighten it away. Dawson came out wiping his hands. "She gave me attitude, but she's running." Annie touched the front fender. "Thank you." "You're welcome." He held up the keys. "Want a starter?" Annie took them. Her hand shook. She opened the driver's door, sat down, and paused with one palm on the steering wheel. Richard stood outside the open door. Dawson stayed back. Annie turned the key. The Buick hesitated, then started. The engine was still old. It still spoke in rattles and uneven breath, but it stayed alive. Annie covered her mouth with one hand and cried so suddenly that Richard looked away to give her room. She bent over the wheel, shoulders shaking, whispering, "Thank you, Mama. Thank you." Dawson cleared his throat. Envelopes in the glove box. Annie wiped her face and opened it. For a moment she moved aside old napkins, a cracked flashlight, a registration folder, and a small tire gauge. Then she found the envelope. It was yellowed, creased, and sealed. Her mother's handwriting crossed the front in blue ink. "For my Annie, when the car gives you trouble." Annie stared at it. "She knew," she whispered. Richard stood very still. Annie opened the envelope with care, sliding a finger under the flap. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper folded twice, and 3 $20 bills, flattened from age. Annie unfolded the letter. Her eyes moved over the words. Her face broke before she reached the second line. "What does it say?" Richard asked softly. Annie shook her head at first, then read, voice trembling. "Baby, if you found this, that old car is acting up again. Don't fuss at her too bad. She carried us through more than we had any right to ask. There's $60 here. It won't fix much, but it might get you gas, a tow, or breakfast when pride tells you not to eat." Annie stopped and pressed the paper to her chest. Richard looked at the cracked windshield, then at the bills in her lap. Margaret had left money she probably needed. Of course she had. Annie forced herself to keep reading. "If I'm gone when you find this, I need you to hear me. The car is not your home, Annie. It is only a bridge. Don't confuse a bridge with the place you're meant to live. Keep going until you find a door that opens without making you beg." Her voice failed. Dawson took off his cap and looked down at the concrete. Annie tried again. "And if somebody ever shows you kindness, don't insult me by refusing it just because you're scared. I raised you to be proud, not lonely." She folded over the paper, sobbing now, no longer able to hide it. Richard felt the words land where apology could not reach. Margaret Carter had reached into this morning from beyond the grave and corrected all of them. Annie held the letter against her face. I thought keeping the car meant keeping her. Richard crouched beside the open door, careful not to touch her. Maybe she left it to carry you until someone could help you carry the rest. Annie looked at him through tears. What if I don't know how to stop living like everything's about to be taken? Then we don't ask you to stop today. She looked at the letter again. She said a bridge. Yes. I don't have a door. Richard stood slowly. You have one for now. And we'll find one that belongs to you. Annie closed her eyes, holding the letter, the $60, and the old ribbon in the same trembling hands. The Buick idled beside them, repaired but still worn, a bridge with an engine, waiting for the next road. Richard followed the Buick back to the house in his own car, keeping a respectful distance behind Annie as she drove. The old Buick moved carefully along the road. Not fast, not smooth, but steady. Every time it stopped at a light and started again, Richard found himself waiting for the engine to fail. It did not. Annie kept both hands on the wheel, the ribbon tied back where it belonged, the photograph of Margaret secured beneath it, and the envelope from the glove box placed on the passenger seat beside her like a person she was bringing home. When they reached the gate, Annie slowed almost to a stop before entering. Richard could see her through the rear window, shoulders held tight, head turned slightly toward the long driveway. Yesterday, this place had been a mistake she wanted to escape. Now it had become something more confusing. Shelter offered by a man she was still afraid to trust. The gate opened. She drove in. Mrs. Alvarez was waiting near the front steps with a dish towel in her hands, as if she had stepped outside in the middle of drying something because worry would not let her stay in the kitchen. When the Buick rolled up the drive, she smiled in a way that did not ask Annie to perform gratitude. Well, she said as Annie stepped out, listen to her purr. Dawson, who had followed in his truck to make sure the car made it back, laughed. That is not a purr, ma'am. That's more like an old man clearing his throat in church. Annie gave a small laugh through tired eyes. Mama used to say the same thing. Richard came around the car. Dawson, send me the final invoice. Dawson shook his head. Already did. I mean the full one. That was the full one. Richard looked at him. Dawson. The mechanic wiped his hands on a rag. Mr. Whitmore, I charged you parts and labor. I did not charge for standing around learning something. That part was free. Richard accepted it because arguing would have insulted him. Thank you. Dawson turned to Annie. Drive it easy for a week. No long trips if you can help it. If a light comes on, don't pray over it first. Call me. Annie nodded, then glanced at Richard. I don't have your number. Dawson took a card from his shirt pocket and held it out. Now you do. And if anyone calls saying they're authorized to move this car, I call you first. Annie took the card with both hands. Thank you, Mr. Dawson. Just Dawson is fine. No, sir, Annie said softly. My mama would have made me say Mr. Dawson. He looked down and put his cap back on. Then Mr. Dawson it is. After he left, Annie stood beside the Buick with Margaret's letter folded in her hand. Richard waited. Mrs. Alvarez waited too. Neither of them rushed her. I don't know where to put it, Annie said at last. The car? Richard asked. The letter. Mrs. Alvarez stepped closer. Some things don't go in drawers right away. You keep them near until your heart stops checking for them. Annie nodded slowly. Can I keep it in the room? Of course. The word room made Annie look toward the house, then down at her shoes. I should probably go after tonight. Dawson fixed the car. I can move around again. Richard had expected this. Still, the sentence hit him harder than he wanted. You don't have to leave tonight. I know you said that. And I don't know what happens if I stay. She pressed the folded letter between her palms. Yesterday I had one problem. A bad one, but one I understood. Car, work, gas, food, sleep. Now there's a room, a house, papers, repairs, people being kind, and I don't know where the ground is. Mrs. Alvarez's eyes softened, but she said nothing. Richard chose his words with care. Then we make the ground smaller. One night at a time. Annie shook her head. That sounds easy when you're the one with the house. Yes, he said. It does. She looked at him, Surprised, he did not argue. "I can offer you the guest room for tonight," he continued. "Tomorrow, we talk about what you want. Not what I want for you. Not what I think your mother would want. What you want." Annie looked toward the Buick. "I want to stop being scared of sleep." The answer came out before she could protect it. She seemed embarrassed by it at once. Richard nodded. "Then tonight, that is enough." Before Annie could answer, a black sedan stopped outside the gate. Richard turned. He knew the car. Harold Benson stepped out wearing the same dark suit from that morning, carrying a leather folder. Richard's face hardened. "Stay here." Annie stiffened. "Is he here for the car?" "No." But Richard was not fully sure what Harold had come to do. The gate opened after Harold pressed the call button and spoke to the security panel. He walked up the drive, controlled and formal, as if the dismissal had been a misunderstanding that could be corrected by posture. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "I came to collect my personal effects and return certain documents. You could have arranged that with Mrs. Alvarez. I thought it best to speak directly." Richard stood between him and the Buick without making it obvious. "Then speak." Harold's eyes moved to Annie, then back to Richard. "Privately." "No." A flicker of irritation crossed Harold's face. "Very well, I'll be brief. You are making a mistake. I have already received 2 calls from staff concerned about the young woman's presence in the house." Mrs. Alvarez's voice came from behind Richard. "Name them." Harold looked at her. "That would be inappropriate." "Convenient." Richard raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, only to keep the exchange from widening. Harold opened the folder. "I also found pending vendor paperwork related to the vehicle repair. If this girl later claims expectation of continued support, the absence of boundaries could become expensive." Annie's face changed. Not surprise. Recognition. She knew this language now. She had heard it from landlords, hospitals, offices, words arranged to make her humanity sound like a liability. "I'm standing right here," she said. Harold looked at her. "Yes, Miss Carter. You are. Then don't call me this girl." The words were quiet, but they stopped him. Richard turned to Annie. She had tears in her eyes again, but she did not wipe them this time. Her hands trembled around Margaret's letter, yet her chin stayed level. "My name is Annie Carter," she said. "My mother's name was Margaret Carter. That car is mine. I didn't come here to trick anybody. I didn't ask him to fix it. I didn't ask for a room. I didn't ask for your opinion. I asked for 2 minutes to start my car." Harold's jaw tightened. "I understand you are upset." "No, you don't." Annie's voice cracked, but she kept going. "You understand rules. You understand property. You understand how to make people feel like they're dirt on clean shoes. But you don't understand what it feels like to have the last thing your mother left you treated like trash because it's old and you're poor." Mrs. Alvarez stood very still. Richard did not interrupt. Some truths needed no rescue. Harold's face flushed. "Mr. Whitmore, this is exactly what I meant. Emotion has overtaken reason." Richard stepped closer to Harold. "No. Reason has been hiding behind comfort." Harold stared at him. "You tried to remove her car after I ordered you not to," Richard said. "You spoke about her as if she were a problem to be contained. You returned today, not to apologize, but to warn me about the cost of decency. I served your family faithfully." "You served the house," Richard said, "not the people in it." Harold's expression hardened. "You will regret humiliating me over a stranger." Richard's voice dropped. "She is not a stranger anymore. And even when she was, she deserved better than you gave her." For a moment, Harold seemed ready to say something sharper. Then he closed the folder. "I'll send for my belongings," he said. "Mrs. Alvarez will arrange it." Harold turned toward the gate. Before leaving, he glanced once at Annie and the Buick, and the look held more resentment than apology. Annie saw it and drew closer to the car. When the sedan pulled away, she let out the breath she had been holding. Richard turned to her. "Are you all right?" "No," she said honestly, "but I'm still here." Mrs. Alvarez nodded as if that answer mattered more than yes. Annie looked down at Margaret's letter. "Mama would have told me I talked too much." Richard shook his head. "I think she would have said you found your voice." Annie's eyes filled again, but this time the tears did not defeat her. She folded the letter once more and held it against her chest. Richard looked at the old Buick resting in the driveway. Yesterday, he had wanted it gone because it made the property look worse. Now it stood there with fresh repairs under the hood and a worn ribbon on the wheel, forcing the house to tell the truth about itself. He turned to Annie. "Come inside when you're ready. The room is still yours tonight." She looked at the front door, then at the car, then at the paper in her hands. "One night," she said. "One night," Richard answered. Annie nodded and started toward the house. Not quickly, not comfortably, but by choice. Annie went back inside with Margaret's letter pressed flat between both hands. The house no longer looked quite as impossible as it had that first morning, but it still did not feel safe in the ordinary sense. Safe was not a word Annie trusted yet. Safe had been used by people who did not have to prove it. Safe shelter, safe process, safe place to wait. Then came locked doors, forms, strangers, rules that changed when she asked questions. This house was warm, fed, quiet, and still strange enough to make her walk carefully along the hall as if one wrong step might expose the mistake of letting her in. Mrs. Alvarez met her at the staircase. "I put fresh sheets on the bed." Annie looked down. "You didn't have to do that. I only slept there once, and now you may sleep there twice." "That is how beds work." Annie gave a tired smile. "Yes, ma'am." Richard followed a few steps behind, carrying nothing, which made him feel useless in a way he was not accustomed to. He wanted to fix something. A bill, a policy, a car, a schedule, but Annie was not an invoice. And Margaret's letter had made that clear. A bridge was not the same as a destination. He could not buy her a destination before asking where she wanted to go. At the top of the stairs, Annie stopped outside the guest room. The door was open. The bed had been made with clean white sheets. Her funeral dress hung in the closet, still inside its plastic sleeve. Her backpack sat on the chair where she had left it. On the small desk, Mrs. Alvarez had placed a glass of water, a notepad, and 2 sharpened pencils. Annie stared at the pencils. Mrs. Alvarez noticed. "You like to write things down. How did you know? You count your belongings with your eyes. People who do that usually count on paper too." Annie stepped into the room and touched one pencil lightly. Mama used to sharpen pencils with a kitchen knife because she said dull pencils made dull excuses. Richard, standing at the doorway, looked away for a second. Every memory Annie offered brought Margaret into the room. Not as a ghost, but as a woman still correcting posture, still teaching thrift, still making language do work. Annie placed the letter on the desk beside the photograph. She set the ribbon next to it, then changed her mind and tied the ribbon around the base of the lamp. The red cloth hung there, small and worn, against the cream shade. Mrs. Alvarez smiled. "That looks right." Annie nodded. "It doesn't feel right if it's hidden." "Then don't hide it," Richard said. "Would you like a lock for the door?" Annie turned to him. "There is one. I mean a better one. One only you control while you're here." She searched his face. "You'd let me lock you out of your own room?" "It is not my room tonight." Annie's eyes filled. She looked annoyed by that, as if tears had become an uninvited habit. "You keep saying things like that. Should I stop?" "No." She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. "I just don't know where to put them." Mrs. Alvarez answered before Richard could. "Put them on the desk with the letter. Sort them later." Annie gave another small, broken laugh. "You always talk like that?" "Only when people need sense." Richard stepped back from the door. "I'll have a locksmith come by. You can decide whether you want it installed." Annie hesitated. "How much?" "No charge to you." She gave him a look. He corrected himself. "I will pay for it. And you will not owe me repayment. We can write that down too if you want." The corner of her mouth moved. "You learn fast. I had a good teacher." Annie looked at the photograph of Margaret. She would have liked that. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Annie's phone buzzed on the desk. She looked at the screen and went still. Richard noticed. "Work?" She nodded. "Mr. Cole, do you want privacy?" "I don't know." She took the phone, stared at it until the buzzing stopped, then called back before fear could talk her out of it. "Mr. Cole, it's Annie." "Yes, sir. I know I missed last night. My car was in the shop. It's fixed now." I can come in tonight if you still need me. She listened. Her face tightened with each passing second. No, sir, I understand. Yes, I understand you had to cover it. I know. I've never missed before. Yes, sir. She closed her eyes. Richard's hands curled at his sides. I can do extra this weekend, Annie said. Inventory, cleaning, whatever you need. Please don't take me off the schedule completely. Another pause. Yes, sir. Thank you. She ended the call and lowered the phone. Mrs. Alvarez asked gently, What did he say? He gave away my weeknights. Annie's voice was steady because she had forced it to be. Said I can have Saturday if I show up early and he'll see after that. Richard said, That's not acceptable. Annie turned on him at once. Don't call him. I wasn't going to. You looked like it. I was thinking it. Please don't. I need to keep something that's mine, even if it's a bad job. Richard took the correction. All right. Annie sat on the edge of the bed. It's only 4 shifts. Mrs. Alvarez's face said she knew 4 shifts could be food, gas, phone, laundry, and the difference between motion and collapse. Richard said, What if you worked for me? Annie looked up sharply. No. You didn't let me finish. I heard enough. Annie. No. She stood again, upset now. That's exactly what I was afraid of. First, the car, then the room, then food, then a job. Then I'm not a person anymore. I'm some sad story you moved into your life so you can sleep better. Richard did not answer too quickly this time. Mrs. Alvarez remained silent, letting the truth do its work. Annie's voice broke. I'm sorry, but I can't be bought into being safe. I can't. I need to know. I can stand somewhere without somebody holding the floor under me. Richard nodded slowly. You're right. She blinked. That came out wrong, he said. I wasn't offering you a position as charity, but I understand why it sounded that way. It did. Then I take it back. She looked suspicious. Just like that? Yes. What if I need a job? Then you apply like anyone else. Human resources, interview, paperwork, the whole irritating process. I won't call it a favor. I won't put you in a place you didn't earn. Annie looked down at her phone. I don't have a degree. Most people working in entry-level office support don't start with one. I don't have office clothes. That can be solved without making you feel owned. She looked at him. How? Richard thought before answering. A clothing voucher through a workforce program, or an advance from wages after hiring, if you are hired, or we find an organization that already helps with that. You choose which door you can walk through. Mrs. Alvarez nodded once, approving despite herself. Annie sat again, slower this time. I wanted to study business. I remember. And accounting. I remember that too. She looked at him carefully. You could really make me apply? I would insist on it. That's strange. Why? Because rich people usually skip the part where other people get to keep their pride. Richard looked toward the lamp with the red ribbon tied around it. I'm trying not to. The afternoon settled around them. A housekeeper passed quietly downstairs. Somewhere outside, a mower started and stopped near the back of the property. Annie looked tired enough to sleep again, but too full of thoughts to lie down. Mrs. Alvarez touched the doorframe. I'll bring up a sandwich later. Turkey or grilled cheese? Annie looked surprised by the choice. Grilled cheese, please. Tomato soup. Annie's face softened. Mama used to make that when it rained. Then tomato soup. Mrs. Alvarez left. Richard remained near the doorway. I'll leave you to rest. Mr. Whitmore? Yes? You said tomorrow we'd talk about what I want. Yes. I don't know the whole answer. You don't need the whole answer tomorrow. She looked at the letter on the desk. I want school. I know that part. And I want a place where I can put my mother's picture without packing it every morning. Richard felt the sentence settle in him with the weight of a promise he had not yet earned the right to make. Then we start there, he said. Annie nodded, but her eyes filled again. I'm scared to want it out loud. I know. No, you don't. He accepted that. Then I'll listen until I do. She looked at him for a long moment, then turned toward the desk. She picked up one of the sharpened pencils and opened the notebook Mrs. Alvarez had left. At the top of the first page, in careful handwriting, she wrote, Things I want but am afraid to count. Richard stepped away from the door and pulled it gently until it was almost closed, leaving her privacy without shutting her in. Downstairs, he walked past the office where Harold's desk had already been cleared. For 9 years, that room had represented order. Now it looked empty in the way a place looks after a bad habit has been removed. In the driveway, the Buick sat beneath the afternoon light. Old, repaired, still marked by weather, but present. Richard stopped beside it and looked through the window at the steering wheel where the ribbon had been tied back earlier, then removed again for Annie's room. The wheel looked bare without it. He understood then that the car had carried her as far as it could. The next step would have to be built with care, not force. Upstairs, Annie wrote 3 lines before the tears blurred the page. School, a door, 1 night of sleep without fear. She read them twice, then placed Margaret's letter beside the notebook so her mother could see. By the next morning, Annie had written the same 3 lines on 5 different pages. School, a door, 1 night of sleep without fear. The words looked simple, almost childish, sitting alone in pencil beneath the guest room lamp, but each time she wrote them, her hand slowed at a different place. School meant forms, fees, transcripts, books, transportation, time she could not sell to a shift manager. A door meant rent, deposit, proof of income, references, an application fee that could disappear even when the answer was no. Sleep meant trusting that no one would knock, tow, evict, shout, or change the rules before morning. She had not realized wanting could be so much work. Mrs. Alvarez knocked at 8 and waited. Annie opened the door with the notebook pressed against her chest. I'm up. I figured. You have the face of someone who argued with a pencil all night. Annie looked down at the pages. It won. They usually do. Mrs. Alvarez handed her a folded towel. Breakfast is ready. Mr. Whitmore asked if you would meet him in the small dining room after you eat. He said no hurry. Annie's stomach tightened. Small dining room? You'll know it because it only seats 12. Annie stared at her. Mrs. Alvarez's mouth twitched. That was a joke, honey. Oh, Annie gave a nervous laugh. Rich house jokes take practice. They do. Annie washed her face, tied her hair back, and placed Margaret's letter inside her backpack before going downstairs. The Buick was visible through the side window as she passed the hall. Seeing it there steadied her. It was still old, still dented, still hers. Breakfast was oatmeal, toast, and coffee with milk, because Mrs. Alvarez had noticed Annie added too much water to coffee when she was trying to make it last. Annie ate at the kitchen table first, not because anyone made her, but because the kitchen felt less formal than the other rooms. Mrs. Alvarez moved around the stove, humming under her breath. You don't have to meet him, she said. Annie looked up. He asked. And you can say no? Annie stirred her oatmeal. People say that, but no usually has a price. Mrs. Alvarez set a spoon in the sink. Then check the price before you answer. That's allowed too. Annie thought about that. At 9, she entered the small dining room. It seated 8, not 12. Though Annie did not know whether that made the joke better. Richard stood near the window with 3 folders on the table and no laptop. He had dressed in a gray suit but no tie, as if trying to appear official and harmless at the same time. Annie noticed. You look like a bank. Richard glanced down at himself. That bad? A nice bank. I'll take the improvement. She sat across from him but kept the backpack near her feet. Richard did not comment. I made 3 calls this morning, he said. Before you say anything, none were to your manager. Okay. 1 was to Georgia State Admissions. I did not give them your story. I asked general questions about deferred enrollment, financial aid reinstatement, and what a student would need to return after a family emergency. Annie's fingers pressed into the notebook cover, and they said the student has to request reactivation through the admissions portal. Aid would need review. Some deadlines passed, but there are appeal processes. Appeal processes, Annie repeated, tired already. Yes, forms. There are always forms. There are, but they are not impossible. She looked at him. They feel impossible when you have to fill them out in a car on 2% battery. Richard accepted that. Then you won't fill them out in a car. Annie looked down. The second call was to a workforce nonprofit my company has worked with before. They help people with interview clothes, resume preparation, transportation cards, entry-level placement. I asked what their process is. I did not give your name. Why not? Because it is yours to give. That answer made her quiet. The third call was to my attorney. I asked about a short-term housing arrangement that does not put you under my roof. does not make you dependent on me personally, and does not require you to pretend you're ready before you are." Annie's face tightened. "An arrangement? A furnished studio apartment owned by a nonprofit partner, used for transitional housing. 30 days at a time. Extendable to 6 months. You would sign your own agreement. You would have a key. You would pay what you can after you are working steadily, even if that amount is small. The rest would be covered through a fund." "A fund with your name on it?" "No." She looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because this is not supposed to be a monument to me." Annie's eyes moved to the folders. "What's the catch?" "The catch is that none of this happens unless you choose it. You can say no to school, no to the nonprofit, no to the apartment, yes to one and no to the others, or not today, to all of it." She stared at him as if trying to find the hidden door under the words. "And the job?" she asked. "If you want to apply to Whitmore Holdings, I'll have HR send you the public application link. You list your education, your work experience, your availability. You interview with someone who is not me. If they offer you a role, you decide whether to take it." "What kind of role?" "Administrative trainee. Filing, invoices, vendor calls, data entry. It is not glamorous." "I don't need glamorous." "I assumed." She frowned. "And you won't tell them to hire me?" "No." "Won't hint?" "No." "Won't say, 'Take a look at this one in your CEO voice'?" Richard paused. "I have a CEO voice?" "Yes." "What does it sound like?" "Like no one has told you no since 1998. Despite herself, she smiled after saying it. Richard smiled too, and the room became less stiff. "I won't use that voice," he said. Annie opened her notebook. Her 3 lines stared back at her. She looked at the folders, then at Richard. "My mother would tell me to ask what happens if I fail. Then you fail at a form, an interview, or a semester, not at being a person." Her eyes lifted. Richard's voice stayed level. "That distinction matters." Annie swallowed. "I don't know if I can do college now." "Then don't decide college today. Decide whether to open the portal." "That sounds like a trick." "It is a smaller door." She looked down at the page where she had written a door. Her hand moved over the words. "Can I think?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Of course." She gathered the notebook, but before she left, she stopped. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes?" "If I take the apartment, does that mean I leave here?" "It means you have a place that is not mine." She nodded slowly. "That sounds better." "I thought it might." "It also sounds scary." "I thought that too." Annie looked toward the window. The Buick waited outside. Brown paint faded under the morning sun. "Mama said the car was a bridge. Bridges scare me. You can see both sides, but you're not on either one." Richard followed her gaze. "Then we do not push." She looked back at him. "But we move?" "When you are ready." Annie gave a small nod and went upstairs. By noon, she had opened the admissions portal on the guest room desk using a laptop Richard had placed outside her door and not handed to her like a gift. That mattered. She could have left it there. She did not. She typed her name slowly, then her date of birth, then her student ID from an old email she had saved because deleting it had felt like burying the last proof that she once had plans. The first password failed. The second failed. The reset link went to an email account she had not opened since before Margaret died. When the inbox loaded, there were old messages from the school, discount ads, overdue notices, and one unread email from her mother's account. Annie stopped breathing for a second. The subject line read, "For when you go back." Her hand hovered over the trackpad. She did not open it. Not yet. Instead, she carried the laptop downstairs, found Richard in the kitchen with Mrs. Alvarez, and turned the screen toward him with tears already in her eyes. "She sent me something," Annie said. "Before she died." Mrs. Alvarez came around the table and looked at the screen. Richard did not move closer. "Do you want to read it alone?" Annie shook her head, then nodded, then covered her mouth. "I don't know." Mrs. Alvarez pulled out a chair. "Then sit first. Big things should not be opened standing up." Annie sat. Her finger trembled over the trackpad. When she clicked, the email opened with 3 short lines. "Baby, if you are reading this, it means you are trying again. Good. Don't make grief your landlord. It charges too much and fixes nothing." Annie bowed over the laptop and cried into both hands. Richard looked at the words, then turned toward the window so she could have the first grief of them without an audience staring. Mrs. Alvarez stood beside Annie and placed one hand on the back of the chair. After a while, Annie wiped her face and read the lines again. Then she opened her notebook beneath them and wrote a fourth line under the first three. Try again. By late afternoon, Annie had filled out half the reactivation form and erased one answer 3 times. The question looked simple. Reason for deferred enrollment. She typed family emergency, then deleted it. She typed medical hardship, then deleted that too. Both sounded clean. In a way, life had not been clean. Her mother had not been a category. Losing a home was not a bullet point. Sleeping in a car did not fit in the narrow box the school had provided. Mrs. Alvarez came in with tomato soup and grilled cheese on a tray. She set it on the desk and glanced at the screen. Forms still acting like forms. Annie rubbed her forehead. They want a reason. Give them one. I don't know how to say it without sounding pitiful. Mrs. Alvarez pulled the chair near the window and sat. Then don't write pitiful. Write true. Annie looked back at the box, then typed slowly. My mother became seriously ill and passed away in April. I became responsible for funeral expenses, medical debt, housing instability, and full-time work. I am requesting reactivation because I am ready to continue my education. She read it twice, waiting to feel shame. It did not come as strongly as she expected. Mrs. Alvarez nodded. That'll do. It sounds cold. It sounds like a young woman who has had enough of begging. Annie saved the form but did not submit it. Not yet. Not yet is allowed. Downstairs, Richard sat with his attorney, Helen Morris. In the office Harold had emptied. Helen was in her late 50s, silver-haired, direct, and the only lawyer Richard trusted to tell him when guilt was pretending to be strategy. She read through the short agreement he had written for Annie's car, then looked over her glasses. This is emotionally honest and legally sloppy. I assumed. I'll fix it. She placed the paper aside. Now tell me what you are actually trying to do. I want Annie to have choices. That is a sentiment. I asked what you are trying to do. Richard leaned back. A temporary apartment through a non-profit. Tuition support structured as a scholarship, not a personal gift. A workforce pathway if she wants it, and protection from anyone in my organization treating her like a liability. Helen tapped her pen once. Good. Keep everything at arm's length. No private dependency. No vague promises. No putting her in your company without a process. I told her she would have to apply. Mean it. I do. Helen studied him. Do you? The question annoyed him because it was fair. I want to help her, he said. I know. You also want to repay a dead woman. That can become dangerous if you make Annie carry the receipt. Richard looked toward the window. The Buick sat outside near the drive. Repaired but still old. Its brown paint dulled by years of sun. Margaret Carter once fed me when I had nothing. And Annie is not Margaret. I know. Make sure your decisions know it too. Before Richard could answer, Mrs. Alvarez appeared at the door. Dawson's here. Richard stood. I didn't call him. He says you'll want to see this. Dawson waited near the Buick with a paper folder tucked under one arm. He had washed the car. Not restored it. Not polished it into something false. Just cleaned it with respect. The windows were clear. The tires had been dressed lightly. The front seat had been vacuumed. Small scratches remained. Dents remained. The tape near the rear window remained because repair would take more time. But the Buick looked cared for. Annie came down behind Mrs. Alvarez and stopped at the porch. For several seconds she did not move. Dawson lifted his cap. Didn't change anything personal. Just washed the road off her. Annie walked down the steps slowly. Her hand went to the hood first, then the driver's door. She looked through the glass and saw the steering wheel clean, the photograph of Margaret still in place, the red ribbon tied exactly as she had left it. You put it back, she said. Dawson nodded. Didn't seem like my place to do otherwise. Her eyes filled. Thank you. He cleared his throat and held out the folder. Also found your maintenance records. Your mama kept more paperwork than the DMV. Annie took the folder. Inside were receipts, oil changes, tire rotations, handwritten notes, all organized by year. Margaret had written reminders in the margins. Ask about brakes, check heater before winter, save for tires. Annie likes the radio station buttons set this way. Annie touched the last line. Richard stood a few feet away, giving her room. Dawson said, "There's something else." Annie looked up, worried at once. "Nothing bad." He pointed to the trunk. "Open it." She did. The trunk rose with a familiar creak. Inside, the space was clean. Her emergency blanket had been folded. The spare tire cover sat flat. On top of it was a new roadside kit, a tire inflator, jumper cables, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. Annie turned to Richard. "You said no extras." Richard looked at Dawson. Dawson raised both hands. "That's on me. I keep kits in bulk. Old cars need friends." Annie stared at the items. "I can't," Dawson cut in gently. "You can. And before you start, no, it is not charity. It is an old mechanic being bossy." Mrs. Alvarez smiled from the porch. "Best kind of bossy." Annie laughed, then cried at the same time. She covered her face with one hand. "I'm sorry. I keep doing this." Mrs. Alvarez called down, "Dollar." Annie laughed harder through the tears. "I'm going to owe you so much honesty. That is the idea." Helen had followed Richard outside and watched the exchange with a lawyer's guarded eyes and a woman's softer ones. She looked at Annie and said, "Miss Carter, I'm Helen Morris. I work with Mr. Whitmore. I've prepared documents about your vehicle. They say no one can authorize repair, transfer, storage, sale, or disposal without your written consent." Annie wiped her face. "In words I can understand?" Helen's mouth curved. "Yes. And in words judges understand. Both versions say the same thing." Annie looked at Richard, then back at Helen. "Can I read them before I sign?" Helen handed her the folder. "You should." That answer mattered. Annie took the papers as if they weighed more than they did. "And if I don't understand something, ask me. And if I don't like something, do not sign it." Annie looked almost startled. "Just like that?" "Just like that." Richard saw Annie's shoulders ease by a small amount. Not enough to call trust, enough to call a beginning. That evening, they ate at the kitchen table, not the dining room. Annie read the vehicle document between bites of soup, while Helen explained terms without impatience. Mrs. Alvarez corrected anyone who tried to talk over Annie. Dawson stayed for coffee and told a story about a Cadillac that once refused to start unless the radio was turned off. Annie smiled more than once, and each smile appeared cautiously, as if asking whether it was allowed to stay. After dinner, Annie signed the car document. Her hand trembled only once. Helen signed as witness. Richard signed as payer. Dawson signed as repair custodian. Mrs. Alvarez insisted on signing the plain language copy as kitchen witness, which made Annie laugh again. When the papers were done, Annie walked outside alone. Richard watched from the porch but did not follow. The Buick sat in the drive under the evening light. Annie opened the driver's door and sat behind the wheel. For a long time, she did not start the engine. She only placed both hands on the wheel near the ribbon and looked at her mother's photograph. "I'm trying again, Mama," she whispered. Inside the house, Richard turned to Helen. "Set up the scholarship under Margaret Carter's name." Helen nodded. "Private or public?" "Private for now. Annie decides later." "Good. And the apartment?" "I'll call the nonprofit in the morning. There's a unit available in Decatur. Small, safe building, bus line nearby." Richard looked toward the car. "Can it be in Annie's name?" "The agreement can be." "Then do that." Helen studied him for a moment. "You're learning." Richard did not take it as praise. Late. Late is still better than never. Outside, Annie opened Margaret's maintenance folder and placed the new legal document inside with the old receipts. Her mother had kept the car alive with oil changes, notes, and stubborn love. Annie added her own paper to that history. For the first time, the Buick was not only the last thing Margaret left behind, it was the first thing Annie had protected in writing. The next morning began with a key on the kitchen table. It was not the key to Richard's house. Annie noticed that first. It sat on a plain brass ring beside a folder from Helen Morris's office, a transit map, and a handwritten note from Mrs. Alvarez that said, "Eat before making life decisions." Annie stood in the doorway wearing her own jeans, the gray sweatshirt, and the same careful expression she had worn since arriving, though something in it had changed. Fear was still there. Fear did not leave because a car started or a bed was offered, but it no longer occupied her whole face. Richard sat at the table with coffee. Helen was beside him, reading glasses low on her nose. Mrs. Alvarez moved at the stove. pretending she was not watching. "What is that?" Annie asked. Helen answered first. "A studio apartment in Decatur. Transitional lease. 30 days to start. Renewable up to 6 months. Your name is on the occupancy agreement. You can read every page before deciding." Annie did not move toward the table. "Today? If you want to see it today," Richard said. "Not if you don't." She looked at the key again. "You already got the key." Helen nodded. The nonprofit held the unit because Mr. Whitmore guaranteed funding through a housing assistance account. "That does not obligate you to accept it." Annie gave a soft, nervous laugh. "People keep saying things don't obligate me while putting keys on tables." Richard looked at Helen. "She has a point." Helen closed the folder. "She does." Mrs. Alvarez set a plate in front of Annie's chair. Eggs, toast, and sliced peaches. "Food first. Suspicion works better on a full stomach." Annie sat, still eyeing the key. Richard said, "You don't have to decide alone. You can see the place. You can say no. You can ask Mrs. Alvarez to come with us. You can drive your own car and leave whenever you want." Annie looked up. "My car? It runs. That doesn't mean it likes rich neighborhoods. It survived my lawn." That surprised a smile out of her. She hid it behind the glass of water. After breakfast, Annie drove the Buick behind Richard's car, with Mrs. Alvarez in the passenger seat because Annie had quietly asked her to come. Richard did not comment on that. He only nodded when he saw them together, and for once he understood that trust sometimes chose the kitchen before the office. The apartment building stood on a tree-lined street near a bus stop, a grocery store, and a branch library. It was not new. The brick had darkened with rain and time. The hallway carpet showed wear near the stairs, but the front door locked, the lobby light worked, and the mailbox had Annie's unit number taped neatly inside. The studio was on the second floor. One room, one small kitchen, one bathroom, 2 windows. A twin bed stood against the wall with a clean blanket folded at the foot. There was a small table, 2 chairs, a lamp, and a dresser with drawers that opened without sticking. Nothing matched. Nothing gleamed. Everything worked. Annie stood in the middle of the room and said nothing. Mrs. Alvarez waited near the door. Richard stood in the hallway, not inside, because Annie had not invited him in. Helen placed the folder on the small table. "The agreement is here. Rent contribution starts at 0 for the first month while income and school status are reviewed. After that, it adjusts based on what you can actually pay. No surprise fees. No guest restrictions beyond normal building rules. No one enters without notice except emergency maintenance." Annie walked to the window. Outside, a woman carried groceries from an older sedan. A man in a baseball cap checked his mail. Somewhere below, someone laughed at something ordinary. "It has a window," Annie said. Mrs. Alvarez's face softened. "It has too." Annie touched the window latch. It opened with a small push. Air came in, carrying the smell of damp leaves and traffic from the next block. Annie closed her eyes for a second. Richard looked down the hallway, giving her the privacy of the moment. Annie turned. "If I take it, what happens to the Buick?" "You choose," Richard said from the hall. "It can stay here in the lot. It can stay at my house for a while. It can be serviced again if needed. It remains yours." She looked at Helen. "In writing?" Helen tapped the folder. "Already there." Annie looked back out the window. "Mama said the car was a bridge." Richard nodded. "Yes. I think bridges get tired too." Nobody answered. They did not need to. Annie sat at the small table and read the agreement. It took time. She asked questions. Helen answered each one. Mrs. Alvarez stood by the kitchen counter and checked the cabinets as if testing whether the room had manners. Richard stayed in the hallway until Annie finally looked up. "You can come in," she said. He stepped inside. Annie held the pen but did not sign yet. "I'm scared." "I know. I'm scared if I sign, something bad will happen because I wanted too much." Mrs. Alvarez said, "Wanting a door is not too much." Annie looked at Margaret's letter, which she had brought in her notebook. She opened it and read the line again. "Don't confuse a bridge with the place you're meant to live." Then she signed. Her name looked small on the page, but it was hers. That afternoon, Richard had the Buick brought back to the house one last time. Annie followed in her new key's direction, not yet ready to leave the car in the apartment lot overnight. Dawson came by with a proper cover for it and refused payment for that too, saying old cars deserved blankets when young women were done sleeping in them. By sunset, the Buick rested near the side garden at Richard's house, not hidden, not displayed like a trophy, simply kept with care until Annie decided where it belonged next. The red ribbon stayed on the steering wheel. Margaret's photograph remained beneath it. The maintenance folder lay in the glove box beside the new legal document. Annie stood beside the car with Richard a few feet away. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Then don't yet." She looked at him. "People usually want to hear it. I've heard thank you from rooms full of people who didn't mean it. I can wait." Annie touched the hood. "I still miss her." "You will. I thought getting help would make me feel better." "Does it?" "Some, but it also makes me feel like she's really gone. Like I can't keep pretending she's just in the passenger seat." Richard looked at the photograph. "Maybe she got you to the next stop." Annie wiped her cheek. "She would have liked you saying that." "No," Richard said. "She would have told me I took long enough." Annie laughed through the tears. "Yes, she would have." A week later, Annie submitted her school reactivation form. 2 weeks later, she interviewed for a trainee position at Whitmore Holdings without Richard in the room. She wore clothes from the workforce nonprofit and carried her own resume in a folder Mrs. Alvarez had given her. When HR offered her the job, Annie asked for the offer in writing before saying yes. Richard heard about it from someone else, which pleased him more than if he had arranged it himself. The Margaret Carter Education Fund began quietly. No press release. No photograph of Richard handing anyone a check. Its first purpose was simple: emergency grants for students who lost parents to illness and were one bill away from leaving school. Annie did not know about the fund until Helen showed her the paperwork and asked whether Margaret's name was spelled correctly. Annie stared at the page for a long time. "She cleaned streets," Annie said. Helen nodded. "Then her name can clean a few paths." Months passed. Annie moved into the Decatur studio fully. The Buick came with her after Dawson replaced the tires. The first night she slept there, she put Margaret's photograph on the small table by the window, tied the red ribbon around the lamp, and placed the apartment key beside both. She woke twice, checked the lock, checked the window, then went back to bed. By winter, she had started classes. Accounting on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Business writing online. Work 3 days a week. She was tired, but it was a different tired. It had direction. One evening, Richard visited the apartment at Annie's invitation. He brought no gifts, only a folder of scholarship updates and a bag of peaches because Mrs. Alvarez insisted. Annie made grilled cheese and tomato soup. The Buick sat outside beneath a streetlight. Old paint dull, engine repaired, no longer a bedroom. After dinner, Annie stood by the window and watched people come home from work, carrying groceries, mail, tired feet, ordinary complaints. "I used to think home meant nothing bad could happen," she said. Richard stood beside the table, holding his coat. "What do you think now?" She looked at the key in her hand. "I think it means I get to come back." Richard nodded. Outside, the Buick waited in the lot, not as a failure, not as charity, not as a pile of scrap metal. It was the bridge that had carried Annie through grief, rain, hunger, and fear, until a door opened and stayed open. And somewhere inside every choice that followed was Margaret Carter, a woman in an orange vest who once gave half her lunch to a hungry stranger and never knew the road that kindness would take. The world changed because one poor woman chose kindness when she had every reason not to. The lesson of this story is that kindness is never small, even when it looks ordinary. A meal, a few dollars, a patient word, or a door opened at the right moment can travel farther than we ever know. Annie's mother had very little, yet she gave what she could, and years later that act returned to protect her daughter. The story reminds us not to judge people by where they sleep, what they drive, or how much money they have left. Behind every hardship is a human life, a history, and a dignity that deserves to be seen. True justice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it begins when one person finally stops looking away. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.